There is a moment in history when two forces, entirely unaware of each other's presence, drift toward the same place by accident, and in that collision, everything changes. It happened in the Netherlands in the autumn of 1944, in a small region where the Rhine bends gently northward and the earth seems to hold its breath between seasons. No one planned it this way. The Germans certainly did not expect it. The Allies believed they would find something very different. And yet there, in the space of 9 days, two exhausted panzer divisions would rise from rest and reshape the course of one of World War II's most desperate battles. But first, imagine the world as it was on the morning of September 17, 1944, before anything changed. The light breaks slowly across the Dutch countryside that September, filtered through layers of mist that cling to the fields like something alive and breathing. It is the kind of mist that softens the edges of everything it touches, blurring the borders between one field and another, between the land and the pale sky above. Somewhere beneath that mist, the ancient Rhine continues its patient work, flowing northward at its own unhurried pace, indifferent to the men and machines that will soon gather on its banks. The water has carried that same current for centuries, through Roman armies and medieval knights, and countless seasons of ordinary Dutch life. It will carry on, long after the smoke clears. In the orchards around the small towns of Arnhem and Oosterbeek, the apple trees stand in neat, aging rows, their branches heavy and bent with the weight of late summer fruit. The smell of them hangs in the cool air, that faint sweetness of ripening fruit, mixing with the scent of damp earth and the slow turning of autumn. It is a peaceful smell, the smell of harvest and plenty, of seasons moving as they always have. Church bells stand silent in their towers, waiting for Sunday. The cottages in the villages have their curtains drawn or half-drawn, as they do in any occupied place where privacy is a luxury carefully guarded. If you had walked through this landscape on that morning, before the sky changed, you would have felt the peculiar, unsettling quiet that comes to a place caught between occupier and occupied. There is tension in that quiet, though it is not visible. It lives in the way people keep their voices low. It lives in the glances exchanged between neighbors who wonder what news might come next, what uniforms might appear on the road. The occupation had been grinding on now for nearly 4 years, since 1940, and the Dutch had learned to live inside the spaces between hope and resignation. Some of them, listening to the BBC broadcasts on illegal radios, had begun to whisper that the Allies were coming. The Germans knew this too, of course. They always knew, eventually. But in the fields and villages around Arnhem, there was no sense of urgency yet, no rushing. The mood was one of waiting, the way you wait for a storm that the barometer tells you is coming, but that has not yet darkened the horizon. In the Wehrmacht barracks and scattered billets around this region, men slept in the morning light, or attended to the slow tasks of maintenance and routine. Vehicles were parked in fields, their crews resting nearby. Fuel was low. It had been low for months, ever since the collapse in Normandy and the frantic retreat through France. The men of the Waffen-SS divisions stationed here, the 9th and 10th Panzer Divisions, were veterans in the truest sense. They had seen the horrors of the Eastern Front. Many of them bore the physical marks of it: scars, missing fingers, eyes that held a darkness you could not quite name. They had also fought and struggled through the desperate battles in Normandy just a few months earlier, and those battles had hollowed them out in ways that no official report could quite capture. If you had the ability to walk among them that morning, to hear their conversations as they drank their thin coffee or checked ammunition, you would have heard men who were bone-tired, men who wondered how many more battles there could possibly be, men who, in their quietest moments, harbored doubts about whether any of this could end in anything but catastrophe. These were professional soldiers, many of them conscripted into the SS, or volunteers who had joined for reasons that had seemed clear enough in 1940 or 1942, but which now felt distant and strange. They did not know it yet, but in a few hours, they would be scrambling to mobilize. They would be fighting for their lives and for their unit's survival in the streets and fields they had thought to themselves were going to remain quiet and largely untouched. But all of that lay ahead. In this moment, September 17th, early morning, the mist still lay over the orchards. The Rhine still flowed northward at its ancient, indifferent pace. An old woman in Oosterbeek swept her front step. A farmer somewhere to the south led his cows into the field. A German officer somewhere read a report that did not yet alarm him. And the sky, over it all, remained clear and pale and full of possibility. If you are drawn to stories where fate and accident collide, where ordinary geography becomes a battleground through sheer chance, where two exhausted divisions find themselves suddenly at the center of one of the war's most desperate episodes, then you will want to follow what happens next. If you'd like to journey through the 9 days ahead with me, through the mist and the unexpected violence, through the houses where men took their last stands, through the commanders who had to make impossible decisions in real time, please do subscribe. I will be telling you the full story of the Waffen-SS 9th and 10th Panzer Divisions at Arnhem, how they found themselves in the path of Operation Market Garden, and how they fought against the British 1st Airborne Division in what would become one of the most tragic and defiant episodes of the entire Second World War. The light was still breaking softly across those fields, the church bells were still silent in their towers, and in just a few minutes, the sky would begin to fill with something that no one in that quiet landscape had expected, and everything would transform. And so we come now to a story that would unfold across just 9 days in September, yet one whose echoes in the Dutch soil, in the memory of those who lived it and those who studied it afterward, seem to stretch far longer than a single week. This is the story of two German panzer divisions, the 9th SS Hohenstaufen and the 10th SS Frundsberg, divisions that would find themselves thrust into one of the war's most pivotal moments, almost by accident, almost as if the machinery of history had placed them exactly where they were needed, though none of the men who commanded them had any forewarning of what was coming. If you're drawn to the intricate movements of military history, to the stories of how chance and preparation collide on a battlefield, to the quiet details that military archives preserve about how ordinary men faced extraordinary pressure, then perhaps you might consider subscribing as we move through these nights together. The events we're about to trace, the mobilization, the desperate improvisation, the grinding attrition of urban combat, and the slow tightening of a German ring around an ever-shrinking British perimeter, these form a narrative that rewards patient, careful attention, the kind of attention a nighttime listening offers in fullness. Now, before we step into the confusion and the urgency of September 17, 1944, let us acknowledge the peculiar geography of fate that had positioned these two divisions where they were. The 9th SS Hohenstaufen and the 10th SS Frundsberg were not frontline reserves called up from some distant depot. They had not been hurried northward in the final hours before the airborne assault. Instead, they were resting, exhausted after the grinding campaign in Normandy, where they had been committed piecemeal and worn down in the hedgerows and the Norman bocage. These divisions had been pulled back to the area around Arnhem and Oosterbeek for what their commanders hoped would be a period of rest and refit. The men needed sleep, the machines needed maintenance, the supply lines needed to be rebuilt. It was, one might say, the worst possible moment for either division to be drawn into battle, and yet from a German perspective, it would prove to be the best possible moment for them to be positioned exactly where they were. Consider the improbability of it. Operation Market Garden, the grand Allied design to seize the bridges of Holland and break through into Germany before winter, had been conceived, planned, and executed with only fragmented intelligence about German dispositions in the area. The Dutch underground had sent warnings about SS Panzer Divisions resting near Arnhem. These warnings had reached Allied headquarters, but they had been filtered, doubted, and ultimately set aside. The assumption was that any German armor in the region would be too depleted, too scattered, too far away to matter in the crucial first hours. And yet, almost as if placed by some unseen hand, the two divisions that would prove to be the crucial counterweight to the entire operation were positioned barely kilometers away from where the British 1st Airborne Division would land. What had brought them to this place? The 9th SS Hohenstaufen, reformed and rebuilt after Normandy, had arrived in the Arnhem area in early September. Its commander, Sturmbannführer Wilhelm Bittrich, though by this point he held the rank of Brigadeführer, a general in all but the most formal sense, was a man of considerable tactical skill and iron discipline. Bittrich had overseen the reconstruction of both divisions after the Normandy campaign, gathering scattered survivors, integrating new replacements, and attempting to forge them back into coherent fighting formations. The 10th SS Frundsberg, under the command of Brigadier Führer Heinz Harmel, had completed similar work. Both men were products of the SS officer corps, shaped by its particular culture of aggressive tactics and ideological commitment. They were also, by 1944, pragmatic commanders who understood that ideological fervor alone could not make up for fuel shortages, worn-out vehicles, and insufficient replacements. The soldiers themselves, many of them young, some of them quite newly conscripted into the Waffen-SS divisions, were weary. They had seen enough of combat to lose any lingering romanticism about it. Yet the ethos of the SS divisions, that sense of belonging to an elite formation with a special mission, remained woven into their sense of purpose. They were not the fresh, ideologically fervent volunteers of 1942 and 1943. They were the survivors of Normandy, hardened and skeptical, yet still bound by the discipline and the camaraderie that sustained fighting units under stress. The refit program had been proceeding with deliberate slowness. Fuel was scarce. It was always scarce by this point in the war. Replacement vehicles were difficult to come by. The supply system that had once kept German divisions well equipped had begun to fray under the strain of fighting on two fronts. And yet both divisions were, if not fully combat ready, then at least capable of rapid mobilization. Their officers knew the terrain around Arnhem and Oosterbeek, the towns and villages, the roads and the bridges. Some of them had conducted operations in Holland before. The geography was not unfamiliar, even if the specific role they were about to play remained unknown to them. Somewhere in Oosterbeek, at the headquarters of Field Marshal Walter Model, commander of the German forces in the West, the ordinary rhythms of military administration continued. Model was a man of significant reputation, a field marshal with a record of success on the Eastern Front. He had arrived in the West only recently, tasked with stabilizing the German position after the catastrophes of Normandy and the collapse of Army Group B. His headquarters, positioned in Oosterbeek, was situated almost at the geographic center of what would become the Arnhem battle. The irony of this, that the senior German commander in the region would be located so close to the primary British objective, was not lost on those who witnessed it afterward. In that moment, though, it was simply geography, unremarkable and routine. And the nights in September in Holland are quite gentle. They grow cool, but not yet cold. The summer warmth lingers in the earth. The air carries the scent of the approaching autumn, of orchards beginning to ripen, of the river's damp presence. In those final hours before September 17th, before the sky would suddenly fill with contrails and the shadows of transport aircraft, and before the gentle autumn night would be shattered by the roar of engines and the opening of bay doors and the cascade of men and supplies beginning their descent, the countryside around Arnhem held to its customary quiet. German sentries walked their posts. The soldiers of the 9th and 10th SS Panzer Divisions rested in their billets, in farmhouses and barns, in requisitioned buildings throughout the region. They slept as soldiers sleep, lightly, accustomed to waking quickly if called upon. Some of them would sleep through the night that would change everything. Others would remember, for the rest of their lives, the moment they were awakened to learn that an entire British airborne division was falling from the sky above them. The men who planned the great airborne operation in the summer of 1944 believed, or perhaps allowed themselves to hope, that the war in Europe might be decided in a matter of weeks rather than years. The Soviet advance from the east was relentless and gathering momentum, but in the west, the Allied armies had only just broken out from the Normandy beachhead. General Dwight Eisenhower and his subordinates faced a strategic choice that seemed to crystallize as September arrived with cool autumn air sweeping across the Rhineland into something approaching certainty: push forward with cautious, methodical strength across a broad front, or concentrate an enormous force at a single point and attempt something bold enough to shock the entire German defensive system into collapse. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, commanding the British and Canadian armies in the north, had long nursed a conviction that a single thrust, a concentrated dagger aimed at the heart of German-occupied territory, could pierce through to the Rhine and beyond, perhaps even to the Ruhr itself. The Rhineland, that strategic threshold, seemed to hover in the late summer air like a promise. Whoever crossed it first, whoever could pour armies across those ancient bridges at Arnhem, Nijmegen, and Grave, might unlock the entire occupation of the Netherlands and open a direct corridor toward the industrial heartland of Germany. And if that could be accomplished quickly, before the autumn mud came and winter weather closed in, then perhaps the war really could end not in 1945 or 1946, but before the year's end. That was the whisper in headquarters, the hope that animated the planning sessions. By Christmas, the shooting might finally cease. The operation that took shape, codenamed Market Garden, was breathtaking in its ambition and, in retrospect, contains within it the seeds of the difficulties that would unfold. The plan called for the Second Army under General Sir Miles Dempsey to punch forward on the ground, breaking through German defensive lines that were, in truth, often thin and improvised. Ahead of this ground advance, 3 divisions of airborne troops would be dropped or landed by glider in carefully coordinated phases. The American 101st Airborne Division would seize the crossings near Eindhoven in the south, securing the southern segment of what was to become an airborne corridor. The American 82nd Airborne Division, under General James Gavin, would land further north near Nijmegen, tasked with securing those bridges against the day when British armour could link up with them. And deepest into enemy territory, north of the River Maas and furthest from immediate support, the British 1st Airborne Division, under General Robert Urquhart, would secure Arnhem and, most critically, the great road bridge there. That bridge, in particular, seemed to glow on the maps in senior headquarters with almost mythic significance. The bridge at Arnhem was the key that would unlock everything. The entire concept rested on an assumption that has echoed through military history countless times before and since, that speed and surprise, combined with firepower and the sheer audacity of the operation's scale, would overwhelm German resistance before it could organize. The Germans, it was reasoned, were stretched thin, their reserves were committed elsewhere. The shock of seeing the sky suddenly fill with thousands of parachutists and gliders would, perhaps, paralyze decision-making at critical moments. And crucially, the operation assumed that German forces in the target area were sufficiently weakened by months of combat, by losses in Normandy and beyond, that even hastily assembled resistance would crumble before concentrated Allied power. These were not unreasonable assumptions, in the way military planners must always work with incomplete information. They were, however, assumptions nonetheless. The Dutch landscape itself seemed to conspire with the planners' hopes. The terrain near Arnhem and across the lower Rhine valley is relatively open. The flat fields and scattered villages appeared to offer few natural defensive positions. What resistance there was would, planners imagined, be quickly beaten down. The roads leading north from the German frontier seemed to stretch like invitations. The weather forecast, for that week in mid-September, promised clear skies and good visibility for the airborne drops. Every element seemed to align toward success, or at least toward the illusion of alignment that hindsight reveals as fragile. By early September 1944, the operation had been planned down to intricate detail. Supply lines had been calculated. Air support was arranged. The mechanics of coordination between ground forces and airborne units had been rehearsed. Tens of thousands of soldiers knew their objectives, their drop zones, their routes of advance. The weight of this carefully assembled machine had begun its motion. The moment of execution approached like a train gathering speed on a distant track. In the headquarters and in the minds of the senior commanders, a sense had formed that this operation represented something more than just another military engagement. This was the thrust that might end it all. This was the gamble, and it was a gamble they were prepared to take, because the alternative, a slow, grinding campaign through the winter, a prolonged war of attrition, seemed far more costly in blood and in time. The stakes, as they understood them in September 1944, could not have been higher. The bridge at Arnhem waited, the Rhine waited, and across Europe, millions of people waited for liberation or for further suffering, depending upon how this calculated throw of the dice would fall. The two divisions that would meet the Allied parachutists above the Dutch countryside that September morning carried within them a particular and troubling history, one that had been forged in the fires of conquest and then tempered, ground down, in the mud and flame of Normandy. To understand what they would become in those 9 days around Arnhem, we must first understand what they had already endured and what they believed themselves to be. The Waffen-SS 9th Panzer Division, known by the name Hohenstaufen after the medieval German royal house, had been formed in the winter of 1943, drawn together from cadres of veterans and reinforcements, organized with the meticulous German attention to structure and hierarchy. Unlike the Wehrmacht's regular panzer divisions, which by that stage of the war were increasingly exhausted and depleted, the Waffen-SS divisions maintained a particular mystique within German military circles, a reputation built on fanaticism, cohesion, and a willingness to fight to the last man that conventional units sometimes lacked. Whether this was justified or merely propaganda, the belief in it shaped how both Germans and Allies regarded them. The 9th had been rushed to Normandy in the spring of 1944, arriving piecemeal as the invasion unfolded, and there they had learned the terrible lessons that every German panzer division had to learn when it met the Allies, that armor, however well maintained and however boldly deployed, could not overcome the sheer weight of material superiority arrayed against it. The 10th Panzer Division, Frundsberg, had followed a similar path. Also formed as a Waffen-SS unit in late 1943, it bore the name of a Renaissance military figure, another attempt to anchor SS identity in European history, rather than in the recent, darker ideological soil from which it had actually grown. The Frundsberg, too, had been committed to Normandy, and there it had suffered alongside its sister division in the grinding, attritional warfare of the bocage and the hedgerows. Both divisions had fought with considerable effectiveness. Their tactical skills were genuine, honed through training and combat, yet both had paid an enormous price in men and machines. By the summer of 1944, the Hohenstaufen and Frundsberg were shadows of what they had been at their formation. The casualty rolls were staggering. Officers and NCOs who had survived Normandy, the tank strength had been reduced sharply, replacements came slowly from Germany, and fuel for training new crews was increasingly rationed. The divisions retained their organizational structure on paper, their neat German designations of regiments and battalions and companies, yet the actual fighting strength was far less than the tables of organization suggested. A panzer division nominally contained hundreds of tanks and armored vehicles, yet these two had perhaps a fraction of that number truly combat-ready. The men who remained were harder, in some ways, for having survived, yet also worn thin by months of brutal combat, and the knowledge that the strategic situation was deteriorating month by month. What held these divisions together, what gave them their particular character, was not primarily National Socialist ideology, though that element was present and significant among some officers and men, but rather the bonds of unit cohesion, the sense that they belonged to an elite force, and the professional pride that German soldiers, Waffen-SS or not, often carried into battle. The officers and senior NCOs, many of them career soldiers who had served in the Wehrmacht or its predecessors before the SS expanded, maintained standards of training and discipline even as resources dwindled. At the same time, the Waffen-SS carried a different cultural weight than regular Wehrmacht units. The ideology was more explicit, the fanaticism more pronounced in some quarters, and the historical record of atrocities committed by SS formations was already substantial, even if many individual soldiers within those formations were not personally complicit in war crimes. To understand the men who would defend Arnhem is not to excuse what the SS as an institution had done, but rather to see them as complicated human beings operating within a system of extraordinary constraints and beliefs. As summer turned toward autumn in 1944, both divisions were pulled back from the front lines for rest and refit. They had been bleeding away, and the German High Command, whatever its other failures of strategy and judgment, understood that depleted divisions needed time to recover, to receive replacements, to repair and redistribute what equipment remained. This is where fate placed them, in that precise geographical location that would prove so consequential, near Arnhem, in the Dutch province of Gelderland, resting and refitting, receiving a trickle of new vehicles and personnel, their officers and men unaware that they were being positioned, by pure chance, at the centre of an enormous Allied airborne operation that was even then being readied in the camps and airfields of southern England. The men of the Hohenstaufen and Frundsberg did not know what was coming. They had survived Normandy. They had lost comrades, endured artillery barrages and fighter-bomber attacks, fought through the close and bitter combat of the hedgerows. Now they rested, and in that rest they might have imagined that they would remain there for weeks, recovering, rebuilding, perhaps eventually being committed to some other sector of the front, that their units would be tested again almost immediately, that they would face a completely novel form of warfare in the form of large-scale airborne assault, that their scattered, weakened battalions would be called upon to improvise a defense against thousands of paratroopers dropping from the sky. None of this was visible to them in those quiet days of mid-September. The river flowed on, the Dutch autumn advanced, and in Germany, in the headquarters and staff offices, plans were being finalized for something that would bring these tired divisions into contact with one of the boldest and most ambitious military operations of the entire war. What if the very thing meant to trap an enemy became the mechanism of its own undoing? What if the careful placement of a chess piece, arrived at through exhaustion and circumstance rather than grand strategy, was to sit directly in the path of an approaching storm? In the late summer of 1944, as the echoes of Normandy still reverberated through the fractured Wehrmacht, two Waffen-SS Panzer Divisions found themselves in a condition that many military commanders might have considered merciful. The 9th Panzer Division Hohenstaufen and the 10th Panzer Division Frundsberg, both severely mauled during the brutal hedgerow fighting and the collapse of the German line after the Allied breakout from Normandy, had been withdrawn to the Netherlands for what seemed like a much-needed respite. Here, in the rolling countryside around Arnhem and Oosterbeek, with orchards surrounding small villages and the broad Rhine cutting through the landscape like a scar that might in time heal, these divisions were being refitted and reconstituted. It was not a matter of choice, really, but of necessity, born from attrition, and supply lines stretched thin across a continent slipping away. The 9th SS Hohenstaufen had been formed in 1943, drawing much of its cadre from the 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte, itself a unit with deep roots in Nazi ideology and the machinery of power. By 1944, after months of continuous combat in France, the division was a shadow of what it had been in the spring. The tanks were fewer now, the men were fewer. Some of the junior officers and enlisted men had never known anything but war since joining up, and the older officers carried the weight of a campaign that had changed from triumphant to desperate almost imperceptibly. The 10th SS Frundsberg, raised similarly and committed to the same grinding campaign in Normandy, presented a parallel picture of exhaustion meeting recovery. Both divisions had come through the desperate fighting in the Bocage with roughly 40 to 50% of their authorized strength. They were hollow formations, reinforced in part by fresh conscripts and replacements who had little of the fanaticism or experience of the original cadre. Yet, they remained formidable in their training and in the quality of their remaining equipment. And so it came to pass, through no design of their own, that these two depleted but still dangerous panzer formations found themselves concentrated in exactly the wrong place, or perhaps the right place, depending on how one measures such things. The area around Arnhem, including the towns of Oosterbeek and Ede to the south, had been selected as a regrouping zone partly because it was perceived to be relatively quiet. The front lines were still some distance away to the south and east. The advance of the Allies had seemed, to German high command, to be settling into a more methodical pace after the initial momentum of the breakout. There appeared to be time for rest, for the arrival of replacement vehicles and men, for the men to sleep uninterrupted by artillery fire and the constant movement that characterized combat operations. The quiet of those early September days carries with it a kind of tragic irony that deepens with knowledge of what was about to unfold. The soldiers of the Hohenstaufen and Frundsberg, many of whom had seen their comrades fall in Normandy, found themselves in what felt like an accidental oasis. There were villages nearby. There were locals, many of them watching the Germans with a mixture of fear and something else, perhaps a faint glimmer of hope that the war might yet end, that liberation might be just beyond the horizon. The division commanders had set up their headquarters in the area, and the administrative apparatus of command had begun to establish itself. Officers were billeted in farmhouses, tank crews were performing routine maintenance on their panzers, the men cleaned weapons, checked ammunition, wrote letters home that might never arrive, and wondered, as soldiers always do, how much longer it would go on. Consider for a moment the geography of chance at work here. The two divisions were not concentrated in one location, but rather spread across the region in a pattern dictated by the availability of billets, the need to disperse for security, and the tactical doctrine of the time. Elements of the Hohenstaufen were positioned near Arnhem itself, in and around the town. Other elements were located further afield, some south toward Nijmegen, others to the east. The Frundsberg, similarly, was distributed across a broad area. This dispersal meant that when the moment came, when the sky would darken with parachutes and the sound of aircraft engines would roll across the orchards and farmland, no single point of German concentration could immediately respond as a unified force. Yet the very dispersal that kept them from immediate coordination also meant that they were positioned like the teeth of a comb, spread across multiple approaches, multiple roads, multiple potential lines of advance. The men did not know, as they rested in those last days of peace, that the very ground beneath their boots was about to become the crucible of one of the Second World War's most dramatic contests. They could not have anticipated that their exhaustion, that their partial refitting, that their scattered deployment would place them at the exact intersection where one of the most audacious Allied operations would unfold. Field Marshal Model, the commander of German forces in the area, had earlier expressed a faint concern about the possibility of an airborne landing, a worry that had been noted but not acted upon with particular urgency. After all, airborne operations were costly and required favorable conditions. The weather had been uncertain, supplies were low. It seemed more likely that the Allies would continue their methodical advance by conventional means. And yet the hand of fate, if such a thing exists beyond the realm of chance and the accumulation of small decisions, was moving the pieces into place. The men of the 9th and 10th SS Panzer Divisions, unwitting actors in a drama they did not yet know was about to begin, continued their routines. They maintained their vehicles. They slept in beds rather than foxholes for perhaps the first time in months. They allowed themselves, tentatively, to believe that there might be time ahead. The Rhine flowed past as it had flowed for centuries, indifferent to the calculations of generals and the hopes of exhausted soldiers. The orchards continued their late summer ripening. The church bells in the nearby villages rang out their measured hymns. None of them knew that in just a matter of days, this same ground would become contested, burning, a place where the remnants of their divisions would face an enemy descending from the sky, bringing with them the weight of an operation conceived in London, planned in meticulous detail, and about to be unleashed with a scale and audacity that only the desperate or the supremely confident would dare attempt. The thing about great fortunes in war is how often they rest upon the simple accidents of geography, the way a commander's tent might be pitched mere miles from where history is about to break open, and nobody knows it yet. In the soft afternoon of mid-September, as the Dutch summer was bleeding into autumn, Field Marshal Walter Model had established his headquarters in Oosterbeek, that quiet town nestled in a curve of the Rhine's lower reaches. Oosterbeek was not a place of strategic grandeur. It was modest, residential, a place where merchants and small landowners had built solid homes with gabled roofs, where the Airborne Museum would one day stand, where families were still tending their gardens in those last few days before everything changed. Model, the so-called Führer's fireman, the commander who had earned that title by appearing at crisis points and somehow steadying the German line, had chosen this location for the Army Group B headquarters, partly because it offered reasonable proximity to his scattered forces, partly because the town itself lay inland enough to feel removed from immediate danger. The irony, and there is rarely a moment in military history quite so thick with it, was that Model had positioned himself within walking distance of the very ground where an entire Allied airborne army would land within 48 hours. Picture, if you will, the peculiar geography of that situation. The Oosterbeek area, with its forests and its network of roads, and its scattering of civilian buildings, would become the focal point of the British 1st Airborne Division's desperate fight for survival. The landing zones themselves, the open fields and heathland called Heelsum, lay just a few kilometers to the north and east, and Field Marshal Model, with his adjutants and his signallers and his liaison officers, was conducting the war from within that very radius of falling paratroopers and gliding soldiers. It was almost as though the Allies, in planning Operation Market Garden, had inadvertently choreographed a collision not just with German combat troops, but with the very nerve center of German command in the region. Model himself was a striking figure in the German officer corps of 1944. Unlike some of his peers, he had maintained a reputation for operational competence and tactical flexibility right through the catastrophes of the Russian front and the Normandy retreat. He was not, in the popular imagination, a convinced Nazi in the ideological sense, though he served the regime loyally enough. What interested him was the problem before him, the chess game of movement and concentration and denial of space to the enemy. He was 61 years old by this point, weathered by 4 years of continuous command, carrying in his bearing and his manner the weight of a man who had seen too much terrain lost, too many divisions dissolved, too many impossible orders filtered down from Berlin. His nickname, the Fireman, derived from the German phrase Brandmeister, which suggested someone called to extinguish one crisis only to find another already burning. The thought that an entire Allied airborne corps might appear on his very doorstep, that his headquarters might become entangled in street fighting within hours, would have seemed almost absurd to him on that September morning. The headquarters itself occupied several buildings, a dispersed arrangement typical of German command practice by this stage of the war. Security was always a consideration. A concentrated installation was vulnerable to air attack, so Model's staff was spread across different locations in and around Oosterbeek, connected by radio and telephone, by couriers on bicycles, and in staff cars. There would have been the usual bustle of a field headquarters in operation. Officers studying maps, signals personnel handling radio traffic, supply officers trying to scrounge fuel and ammunition from increasingly depleted depots, adjutants preparing briefing papers, the whole careful machinery of command attempting to maintain order and directives across a front that stretched far beyond Oosterbeek, far beyond the Netherlands itself. The men who worked there were professionals, many of them career soldiers who had spent decades in uniform, accustomed to the rhythms of military life, the hierarchy and protocol, and the assumption that tomorrow would resemble today in its basic structure. One might wonder what Model was thinking in those hours, what occupied his mind as he reviewed reports from his scattered divisions, as he contended with the endless demands of coordinating defences across a vast geographical space. The southern Netherlands, the area around Eindhoven and Nijmegen, was not considered a likely target for major operations. The consensus among German intelligence officers was that any new Allied offensive would likely come from the west, perhaps an attempt to cross the lower Rhine or to secure a bridgehead further north along the Dutch coast. The intelligence picture, as it so often does in war, was incomplete and colored by assumptions. The Germans knew that American and British airborne forces were maintained in a state of readiness. Everyone knew this. But the specific timing, the specific location of an operation like Market Garden, remained obscured. The skill of Allied operational security, the deceptions and the misdirections, had done their work. Model's daily routine, it is worth imagining, would have carried none of the tension that the reader or listener now knows was about to arrive. He would have risen in the morning, perhaps taken a brief walk. Model was known to appreciate such moments of solitude, and then returned to the cascade of reports and decisions that filled a field marshal's day. The weather would have been noted, the occasional reconnaissance report would have arrived, the usual intelligence summary would have been prepared. There was no particular alert status that morning, no sense that the air above the Netherlands was about to fill with transport aircraft, that the roads leading into Oosterbeek would become killing grounds, that the Field Marshal's headquarters would very soon need to be evacuated in some haste. And yet this is precisely what made the moment so quietly remarkable. Here was one of Germany's most capable commanders, ensconced in a peaceful Dutch town, surrounded by the tools and trappings of command, while history was, quite literally, preparing to descend upon him from the sky. The Dutch civilians in Oosterbeek went about their modest routines, unaware. The soldiers of the 9th and 10th SS Panzer Divisions rested or maintained their vehicles, or prepared what meagre meals they could manage. Model studied his maps. The Rhine flowed on, indifferent to the designs and calculations of men. The morning of the 17th arrived mild and clear across the Dutch lowlands. The kind of autumn day when the light seems to linger longer than you'd expect, when the air carries that peculiar stillness that comes just before something vast shifts. The men of the Waffen-SS divisions had awakened as they had for weeks, some in repurposed farmhouses, others in hastily prepared battalion areas, their vehicles scattered in neat lines among the trees, fuel drums stacked and inventoried, ammunition sorted into crates. The war, for them, had seemed almost suspended in that moment. There was routine, there was the slow work of repair and reorganization, there was the particular exhaustion of soldiers who have fought hard and are being allowed, briefly, to remember what rest feels like. And then, at some point in that luminous morning, a sound began, not sharp at first, distant, a low thrumming that seemed to come from everywhere at once, from the very air itself. The kind of sound that makes you pause, that lifts your head from whatever small task occupies your hands and turns your attention upward. It was the sky filling, very slowly at first, with aircraft, thousands of them. A fleet so enormous that those who witnessed it in later years would struggle to find words precise enough to convey the sight. The sheer, overwhelming presence of that armada, moving eastward into German-held territory, almost leisurely in its approach, as though it had nothing to fear and all the time in the world. Consider for a moment what it would have looked like from the ground, not from the perspective of those who planned the operation or commanded from above, but from the viewpoint of a young Waffen-SS soldier standing in a farmyard near the Rhine, looking upward. The first wave would have appeared as clusters of dark shapes, moving in formation with mechanical precision, and then as individual aircraft became distinguishable, Dakotas, the sturdy twin-engine transports, their forms growing larger, more detailed, more unmistakably present with each passing second. The sound would have grown louder, not explosively, but with a kind of steady crescendo, a deep and resonant hum that seemed to vibrate in your chest, in your teeth, in the bones of the small structures around you. And then the parachutes began to bloom. This is perhaps the detail that separates the experience of those moments from any mere description. Parachutes blooming across the sky like an enormous garden of fabric, opening in silent succession, thousands upon thousands of them, catching the light in subtle gradations, creams, tans, off-whites. against the blue and grey of the autumn atmosphere. The sight would have been almost meditative in its way, if the implications had not been so immediately and starkly clear. Each parachute represented a soldier, a weapon, an enemy descending in organized fashion toward the ground. The men watching from below would have had that strange, disorienting experience of time seeming to stretch. The transports moved with what seemed like deliberate slowness. The parachutes descended with what appeared to be an eternity of floating, a kind of drift that was hypnotic even as it was terrifying. And yet, the entire process, from the first appearance of the formations to the moment when the first paratroopers were touching ground, occupied only minutes. It is a peculiarity of such moments that they expand subjectively, that clock time and experience time diverge completely, so that what was in fact perhaps 3 or 4 minutes of intensive activity felt to those witnessing it as though it unfolded across a much longer, more elaborate arc. The gliders came too, of course, the big wooden machines, ungainly and ungraceful in the air, being towed by their transport aircraft until the moment of release, then spiraling downward with a particular kind of controlled descent that was somehow both elegant and ominous. They landed in fields and clearings, in some cases deliberately chosen areas, in others wherever the pilot could find a patch of relatively flat ground. The sound of them touching down was distinctive, not explosive, but substantial, the crunch and crack of heavy aircraft making contact with earth and crops, the skidding and lurching as they came to rest. In the midst of this, what can only be described as an organized silence began to break. The initial shock, that moment of absolute stillness as soldiers processed what was happening, gave way to a kind of urgent, controlled frenzy. Telephones began to ring, or runners began to sprint between command posts. Orders that had been prepared for this theoretical emergency began to be issued as practical commands. The vehicles that had been arranged so neatly a few hours before began to move, pulling out of their protected positions, heading toward roads that would take them toward the landing zones. But before any of that could truly cohere, there was another wave, and then another. The sky remained dark with aircraft for what seemed like hours, though again, the actual duration was compressed. By the afternoon, the scope of the operation had become undeniable. This was not a raid. This was not a minor incursion. This was the arrival of an entire corps of airborne troops, descended almost simultaneously into terrain that the Waffen-SS divisions had, only hours before, considered their own domain. The peculiar aspect of this arrival was that it was, in many respects, visible to both sides almost equally. There was little secrecy in it, little deception. The British and American planners had calculated that the sheer overwhelming numerical advantage would preclude the need for tactical surprise. Speed of execution, they had theorized, would compensate for the absence of genuine surprise. The Germans, observing this enormous movement of aircraft and men, had almost as much warning as it was possible to have of an impending assault. And yet, warning and readiness are not the same thing. A man who sees an avalanche descending toward him has warning, but that does not necessarily mean he can escape. As the parachutes and gliders continued to fill the sky, as the first parties of British paratroopers began to establish their beachheads in the fields and clearings around Arnhem and Oosterbeek, a question began to form in the minds of the German commanders. Where, precisely, was the main weight of this assault falling? The operation was so vast, so multifaceted, that it was not immediately clear what the enemy's primary objective might be. And this question, this uncertainty about where the true strike was being aimed, would shape the next hours in ways that were not fully predictable even to those doing the commanding. The September afternoon deepened. The sky gradually cleared as the transports turned back westward, their cargo delivered. The sound of aircraft engines receded. The parachutes settled to earth. The gliders sat, some damaged, some intact, disgorging their passengers and equipment. The Rhine flowed on beneath the clouds, indifferent to the vast military operation now unfolding on its eastern banks, just as it had flowed through countless previous moments of human conflict and human peace, carrying its waters toward the North Sea, with the patient inevitability of nature operating at a scale that transcends any single moment of human history. The moment the first parachutes bloomed across that September sky, a single man's decision would shape the next 10 days more profoundly than almost any other factor on either side. That man was General Wilhelm Bittrich, commander of the SS Panzer Corps. Unlike many of the Wehrmacht officers stationed near Arnhem that morning, Bittrich possessed something rare in the closing year of the war: a clear mind, intact communications infrastructure, and the authority to act without endless layers of approval. He was 51 years old, a career soldier who had learned to trust his instincts in moments of chaos, and chaos, when it arrived, would come swiftly and completely. Bittrich had established his corps headquarters at a small administrative building in Oosterbeek, not far from where Model himself was stationed. The irony of this placement, German command nestled at the very heart of the zone the Allies were targeting, would never fully sink in until the shooting began. But in those opening hours, it worked to the Germans' advantage in ways the planners in London could not have anticipated. Bittrich had direct access to telephone lines, to radio frequencies, to messenger networks that still functioned reasonably well despite the deteriorating state of German logistics. When the first reports arrived of airborne landings around Arnhem and Nijmegen, he did not hesitate. What is perhaps most striking about Bittrich's response is how quickly he grasped the shape of the threat. Some German officers that morning were confused, uncertain whether this was a localized raid or the beginning of something far larger. Bittrich understood almost immediately that this was an attempt to seize the Rhine crossing and drive deep into the Ruhr, to unhinge, in other words, the entire German position in the west. The breadth and precision of the Allied landings told him so. He had seen enough of the war by September 1944 to recognize a coordinated strategic operation when one unfolded before him, and his response was equally swift. He ordered the 9th SS Panzer Division Hohenstaufen to move north, toward Arnhem at once, and he positioned the 10th SS Panzer Division Frundsberg to block any advance from the south through Nijmegen. The beauty of this decision, and it was beautiful, in a terrible military sense, lay in its immediate execution. Bittrich did not wait for confirmation from higher command. He did not telephone Model to ask permission. He understood that in the opening hours of an airborne operation, German victory or defeat might hang entirely on whether or not German armor could be brought to bear before the British paratroopers could dig in. The first hours, he knew from experience and from military theory, would be crucial. And so he moved. What followed was a cascade of improvisation. The Hohenstaufen, as we have noted, was not at full strength. Its battalions were scattered, many units still regrouping from the Normandy campaign. But Bittrich had not survived this long by waiting for perfect conditions. He ordered the division's commander to assemble whatever was at hand, whatever tanks could be fueled and started, whatever personnel carriers were available, whatever anti-tank guns and field artillery could be scraped together, and to move it toward Arnhem immediately. The men of the 9th SS, many of them veterans of bitter fighting in France, understood what was being asked of them. They began to move. Parallel to this, Bittrich issued orders to the Frundsberg to organize a defensive line south of Arnhem, particularly around the town of Nijmegen, where the Germans correctly anticipated that American airborne units would land and that British armor would attempt to punch through from the south. Here again, the emphasis was on speed rather than preparation. Bittrich knew that every hour gained by the Germans was an hour lost for the Allies. The Allies' entire operation depended on a rapid link-up between the airborne forces and the ground forces pushing up from the south. If the Germans could slow that link-up, could create friction and delay, they might be able to contain and crush the airborne force before it could be relieved. What is remarkable about these early orders is how clearly Bittrich's thinking reflected an understanding of what the Allies were attempting. He had not seen the detailed plans for Market Garden; those remained locked in Allied headquarters, yet he intuited the operation's shape and logic. Seize the crossings, drive deep, create a breakthrough. This was classic blitzkrieg theory turned against its inventors. And Bittrick, having fought the Allies for years, recognized it instantly. His response was not to defend a fixed line, but to move to meet the threat, to harry it, to disrupt it, to buy time for other German forces to be brought forward. The telephone lines crackled throughout that morning, with orders and counter-orders. Messengers on motorcycles raced through the Dutch countryside, carrying written directives to scattered battalion headquarters. Radio operators, speaking in carefully coded language that nonetheless conveyed urgency, began reaching out to scattered units of both panzer divisions. The machinery of German military command, corroded by years of war and by the peculiar dysfunction that had gripped the upper ranks of the Wehrmacht, nonetheless responded. Not perfectly, not smoothly, but it responded. Some have suggested that Bittrick made a crucial error in his early dispositions, that he concentrated too much force around Arnhem itself and did not adequately cover the approaches from the south, or conversely, that he spread his forces too thinly. The truth is more nuanced, perhaps, than either of these judgments suggests. Bittrick was working with fragmentary information and with forces that were not remotely adequate to the task he had been given. He was improvising, as men at war often must, according to the best judgment he could exercise in real time. What matters is that he exercised it quickly, decisively, and with a clear understanding of what was at stake. The men receiving these orders, the battalion commanders, the NCOs, the individual soldiers of the 9th and 10th SS Panzer Divisions, had not slept well the night before, if they had slept at all. There was something in the air, some collective sense that the war was reaching a new threshold, and now, suddenly, they were being called to action. Tanks that had been parked for maintenance were hastily refueled, ammunition was distributed. Men were roused from rest areas and assembly areas, told to grab their gear. The enormous machinery of a panzer division, even one depleted and hastily reassembled, began to turn over. By mid-morning of September 17th, the first German columns were moving toward the sound of the guns. They would not arrive everywhere they needed to be, and some would arrive too late to prevent the British from achieving their initial objectives. But they would arrive, and their presence would be felt, and the battle for Arnhem would be shaped in those opening hours, not only by what the Allies did, but by what Bittrick decided to do in response. The war, as it often did, would hinge on the decisions made by a handful of men in a handful of hours, and those decisions, once made, would unfold across the next 10 days in ways that neither side could fully foresee. The moment General Bittrick understood what had fallen from the sky, a peculiar paralysis descended upon the German command structure, not one born of confusion, but rather the slow, almost dreamlike realization that theoretical plans must now become immediate action. The 9th SS Panzer Division Hohenstaufen, the very unit resting in and around Arnhem itself, was scattered, fragmented. Each company, each platoon, each small cluster of men and machines occupied a different corner of the landscape, and no single commander could gather them all at once. This was the cruel arithmetic of defeat and refit, a division broken down into its component pieces, spread thinly across an area meant for recovery, not for the furious mobilization that now demanded every moment count. The men of the Hohenstaufen had arrived at Arnhem in late August, themselves battered remnants of Normandy's grinding horror. They had fought in the bocage, where hedgerows became fortresses and visibility compressed to yards. They had withdrawn across France in the hot, dusty summer, losing tanks to air attack and armor to combined arms tactics they could not counter. The division that pulled into the Arnhem region was perhaps a third of its authorized strength. Tanks that should have numbered in the hundreds arrived in the dozens. Fuel was already scarce. Replacement parts, new uniforms, ammunition, all the sinews that hold a large military formation together, were available only in fractions of what doctrine demanded. This, then, was the shadow of German military power in September 1944, still formidable in its training and discipline, yet increasingly a thing of borrowed time and improvised solutions. When the first reports came in that sunny September afternoon, parachutes descending near Arnhem, gliders landing in the fields toward Ginkel Heath and beyond. The Hohenstaufen's command apparatus faced an agonizing problem. Where were all the pieces? A battalion headquarters sat here. A company of armored reconnaissance vehicles occupied a village several kilometers away. The tank park held perhaps 30 serviceable Panzer IVs and a handful of powerful Panthers, scattered among repair shops because fuel was too precious to keep them all mechanically ready at once. How do you transform stillness into motion when your units exist in fragments? How do you concentrate force when concentration requires resources you do not possess? The officers made their calculations with cold precision. Colonel von Reinhardt, commanding the 9th SS at that moment, would later describe the sensation as one of watching events unfold at a distance, knowing intellectually what needed to happen, while the material world stubbornly refused to obey. Word went out, assemble what you can. Officers dispatched motorcycles to outlying detachments. Telephone calls, where lines still existed, crackled with urgent orders. Get your men under arms. Fuel your vehicles. Move toward the landing zones. The response was not sluggish, but it was not instantaneous either. In war, as in life perhaps, the gap between the decision to act and the moment when action becomes visible is filled with countless small impediments, with distances that must be covered, with the simple physics of moving mass across space. Some battle groups formed within an hour. Others took longer. A small group of paratroopers and engineers, barely 100 men with hand weapons and a single 75mm gun salvaged from somewhere in the bivouac, began moving toward the sound of gunfire almost immediately, almost by instinct. Larger concentrations took time to assemble. The handful of serviceable tanks that could be quickly fueled and armed began to roll toward the city, but with what fuel? The Hohenstaufen's supply situation was such that every kilometer burned through reserves that could not be easily replaced. What would the cost of this mobilization be in days hence, when perhaps fuel would run out altogether? These were the questions that haunted the quartermasters, yet they had to keep moving forward. The enlisted men responded to these orders with the mixture of resignation and professionalism that characterized veteran SS troops. They had done this before, received sudden alerts, seized weapons, climbed onto vehicles, moved to positions. The specific context mattered less than the ritualized repetition of military drill. Orders were orders, officers pointed and men moved. Yet there was something peculiar in the air that afternoon, something these soldiers might have sensed without fully articulating it. This was not another false alarm. The sky itself had changed. The air was full of enemy aircraft. The scale of what was falling from those aircraft suggested something far larger than a raid or a probe. Could this be the great invasion that High Command had always feared? Perhaps, in the depths of their perception, the men of the Hohenstaufen understood they were witnessing the beginning of their division's final chapter. The communications between command posts began to paint a picture of controlled chaos. Reports arrived, not in neat sequence, but in fragments and overlaps. A motorcycle messenger from one sector, a radio operator listening in to a regimental net, an urgent telephone call from a forward observer. The British paratroops were moving toward the road to Nijmegen. No, they were assembling near Arnhem itself. They had seized the high ground at Ginkel Heath. They were attempting to force the road bridges. Each report was accurate to its observer and moment, yet no single account captured the whole. The Hohenstaufen's staff officers had to knit these fragments together in their minds, creating from disconnected intelligence a coherent picture of where they should commit their meager reserves. General Haase, who would assume more direct command as the battle developed, found himself presiding over this apparatus of mobilization. He was a career Wehrmacht officer, not an ideologue, though he served the ideological state, and he possessed the trait that all good commanders must cultivate, the ability to function decisively amid incomplete information. He could not wait for certainty. He could not gather every unit before making decisions. He had to commit forces to movement based on probabilities and guesses, trusting that his subordinates would adapt once they encountered the enemy. This was how wars were actually fought, far removed from the clean geometric plans of the map room. The irony, gentle, historical irony, lay in the fact that Hohenstaufen's dispersal, which now seemed like a terrible disadvantage, would prove to be an asset in certain moments. Because the division was scattered, because its units were not all gathered in one place, it was harder for Allied aircraft to strike it en masse. Because fuel was scarce, men had gotten accustomed to moving on foot, to riding on half-tracks and trucks, rather than relying solely on armored vehicles. Because replacements and supplies were limited, every man was trained to multitask, to serve multiple roles. Constraint, paradoxically, had bred adaptability. Whether this would prove enough, whether improvisation could overcome the enemy's vastly superior numbers and air superiority, remained to be seen. But in those first hours of September 17th, as the Hohenstaufen clawed its way from rest into readiness, the division was doing what armies do best, responding to crisis with the tools at hand, knowing that the alternative to imperfection was catastrophe. While the 9th SS Hohenstaufen was fragmenting across its scattered positions, reorganizing its depleted companies, and searching for functioning half-tracks in the September sunlight, the 10th SS Panzer Division Frundsberg was stirring in its own corner of the operational map, some kilometers to the south, around the villages of Druten and the middle reaches toward Nijmegen. The Frundsberg, like its sister division, had been savaged in the retreat from Normandy. The British and Canadians had extracted a brutal cost in their Bocage campaign through July and August, but the 10th had the particular misfortune of being even more thinly spread than the 9th, its strength scattered across a wider arc of the Rhine's western bank. One might pause here and wonder what commands went through Wehrmacht telephone lines that morning, what calculations the divisional staff officers made as the scale of the Allied drop became apparent through their own reconnaissance networks, and the increasingly urgent radio traffic crackling up from forward observers in the orchards and along the dike roads. The 10th SS Frundsberg's commander was SS Obersturmbannführer Harzer, a younger officer than Bittrich, but no less sharp in his reading of terrain and tactical possibility. Where Hohenstaufen's scattered elements might have found some comfort in proximity to Model's headquarters and the relative clarity of their assigned positions near Arnhem itself, Frundsberg's men had a different and perhaps more acute awareness. They sat astride the direct route between Nijmegen and Arnhem, the very corridor that would become, if the Allies succeeded, the umbilical cord connecting the American airborne forces at Nijmegen to the British forces attempting to take the bridge at Arnhem. To hold this road was to sever that connection. To lose it was to allow the Allies to build a continuous airborne bridgehead across the Rhine, a catastrophe Model could not contemplate. The 10th SS understood this geography, whether they had yet absorbed the full weight of it or not. The mobilization orders that radiated from Bittrich's command post in the early hours would have reached Frundsberg's scattered battalion and company positions with a clarity born of urgency. Unlike the 9th, which had to gather itself from garrison duty and maintenance work, much of Frundsberg's troops were already in a posture of readiness, not high alert, perhaps, but the kind of vigilant stance that Rhine defense required. The division's reconnaissance elements were the first to move, speeding northward along the main roads, toward Nijmegen and its approaches, dust rising behind their vehicles in the warm afternoon as they raced to establish preliminary observation posts and blocking positions. What they would have seen as they drove was a landscape transformed. The sky itself seemed to darken with Allied aircraft, the drone of their engines omnipresent, and already, on the far side of the Rhine, or descending through the air itself, thousands upon thousands of enemy soldiers were taking up positions that would soon constitute the western face of a new German nightmare. The Frundsberg's strength, what remained of it, lay primarily in 2 understrength Panzer Grenadier regiments and a tank company, perhaps 4 tanks, though equipment rosters in September 1944 were often optimistic documents, and the actual availability of AFVs may have been considerably lower. To improvise, to create battle groups from whatever could be gathered, became the order of the day. Officers and NCOs who had fought in Normandy understood this dance. You took what you had. You combined infantry with whatever armor and heavy weapons could be pressed into service, and you moved. The fuel situation was chronic. German logistics in the Netherlands in September 1944 resembled a vast puzzle where pieces were perpetually missing, but Hardser's men had learned to work within those constraints. A battle group might consist of 40 or 50 men, a single functioning half-track, perhaps 2 anti-tank rifles, and the determination of a junior officer or experienced sergeant who understood that the road to Nijmegen was the fulcrum upon which the entire operation would turn. The psychological state of these men, as they mounted up and began moving toward their assigned positions, cannot have been anything but weary resignation mixed with a kind of professional determination. These were soldiers, many of them, who had not yet reached their 20th or 21st birthdays, who had been conscripted or volunteered into the SS during the years when such choices meant something very different than they would mean in 1945, and who had already endured more in 8 weeks of fighting in Normandy than most men experience in a lifetime. The loss of comrades, the constant near misses with Allied artillery, the desperate retreats when lines broke, all of this had worn them thin. Yet here they were, climbing into vehicles whose engines coughed to life, checking rifles and machine guns with the automaticity of the trained soldier, aware on some level that the moment before them would determine whether the Rhine could be held, whether their dying and suffering had meant anything at all, or whether it would all have to be repeated further east, in worse circumstances, with even fewer resources. The road from Arnhem to Nijmegen runs broadly northward and then southeastward, in a sinuous path that follows the natural contours of the Dutch landscape, flat, intersected by waterways, lined with copses of birch and oak. It was this road that Frundsberg's improvised battle groups were ordered to occupy and defend. Not to hold it perfectly, perhaps, that was already becoming an unrealistic fantasy, but to contest it, to delay the Americans, to make any breakthrough sufficiently costly that German reserves could be gathered to seal the breach. Within hours of the drop, elements of the 10th SS were taking up positions along this critical axis, establishing hasty roadblocks with whatever materials could be gathered. Fallen trees dragged across the road, anti-tank guns positioned in buildings overlooking the approaches, machine gun nests in the copses. The improvisation was remarkable, and it would be, in the hours and days to come, remarkably effective. What perhaps deserves a quiet moment of reflection is the fact that the Frundsberg Division, which had been designed and trained in theory to conduct mechanized warfare across open terrain with full logistical support and armor superiority, was instead being employed in a desperate defensive role, playing the part of an anti-airborne cork in a bottle, relying on local knowledge, terrain advantage, and sheer determination to compensate for numerical inferiority and material shortages. This was not what the division's original doctrine envisioned, yet it was what the dying Reich demanded. The war, by September 1944, had become a series of desperate improvisations, and the men of the 10th SS Frundsberg, like countless other German units in those final months, rose to the challenge, not because of ideology, though that played its role for some, but because they were soldiers, and soldiers do what soldiers do in war. They obey orders, and they try to survive. The men of the British 1st Airborne Division had been trained for months in the minutiae of their task, and when the paratroopers drifted down through that clear September afternoon, their minds were already sketching the streets they would traverse, the hedgerows they would use for cover, the distance they had to traverse to reach the bridge. Most of them did not yet know, and perhaps this was merciful, that their divisional commander, General Roy Urquhart, had already become separated from his main force in the confusion of the drop zones scattered across the heath and orchards west of the city, and that they would spend much of the battle learning to act without the coherence that centralized command might have provided. The initial movements were almost dreamlike in their quiet purpose. Men gathered in clusters, checking weapons that had been checked a dozen times before, reconnoitering the terrain around them, getting their bearings from the flat Dutch landscape, where church spires and copses of trees served as landmarks. The drop had been astonishingly successful in one sense. The anti-aircraft fire from the German positions nearest the landing zones had been lighter than intelligence had suggested it might be, and the Luftwaffe, that once terrible presence in the sky, remained almost entirely absent. But this very success was misleading, for it meant that thousands of British and Polish paratroopers were now on the ground, with scarcely a sense of where the Germans actually were, or in what strength. Some of the earliest movements were undertaken by reconnaissance patrols, small groups of men moving cautiously through the outskirts of Arnhem or along the roads that led toward the city's heart. They encountered occasional German soldiers, engineers, supply personnel, stragglers from units that had been moving north, and in these brief, fragmentary encounters, neither side quite grasped the scale of what was about to unfold. A patrol would emerge from a wood to find a German lorry or a squad of men, and there would be a moment of mutual surprise before automatic fire erupted and one side or the other withdrew. These skirmishes were small enough to be almost forgotten afterward, yet they were the first tremors of a much larger collision, the initial warnings that the Germans were aware that something unprecedented was happening above their heads. The main thrust of the British advance, however, was concentrated on the roads leading into Arnhem itself. The 1st Airborne Division had been tasked with a deceptively simple objective: seize the road and railway bridges in the city and hold them until the ground forces pushing up from Belgium could arrive to relieve them. This was expected to take no more than 2 or 3 days. The men who moved along the Arnhem roads in the late afternoon and early evening of September 17th were part of a vast, coordinated operation, and yet they moved through a landscape that was rapidly filling with uncertainty. Civilians watched from the windows of their homes, some welcoming, some simply bewildered, as armed men in khaki uniforms passed through their streets. A few Dutch people offered to guide the paratroopers, providing what intelligence they could about the location of German positions or the best routes through the town. The Germans, for their part, were beginning to react with increasing urgency. General Wilhelm Bittrich, the commander of the SS Panzer Corps, had grasped almost immediately, upon hearing the reports of the landings, that something catastrophic was unfolding. Yet his response could not be instantaneous, for the machinery of military command, even in the hands of experienced officers, required time to shift from routine vigilance to full combat readiness. The men of the 9th SS Panzer Division Hohenstaufen, scattered across their billets and rest areas, were being roused from sleep or from the small tasks that occupy soldiers between campaigns. Orders began to circulate through company and platoon commanders. Vehicles were checked, fuel was loaded, ammunition was distributed. What might have taken a full day in peacetime was being accomplished in hours, but it was still a race against time, in which the British forces already had the significant advantage of position and surprise. The landscape between the drop zones and Arnhem began to fill with movement. Not yet the roar of tanks and the shriek of artillery that would come later, but the steady, methodical advance of men on foot. Patrols pushed deeper into Arnhem's outskirts. Reconnaissance elements reported back on the positions of German troops. Officers at various levels were beginning to form a picture of where their forces were and attempting to orient them toward the bridge, that objective that had been drilled into every man's mind, that single crossing of the Rhine that seemed to contain all the hopes of this vast, complex operation. And yet, even as these advances were being made, even as the first British soldiers pushed into the streets of Arnhem proper, the German divisions were coalescing around them. The Hohenstaufen's scattered units were beginning to move north and east, toward the sound of the fighting that was still sporadic and fragmentary, but growing in intensity. Officers were directing their men toward forming defensive positions, toward blocking the roads that the British must use to reach the bridge. It was not yet a battle in the fullest sense, not yet the massed confrontation of forces that would come later in the day and night ahead, but rather a series of small clashes, of ambushes and counter-ambushes, of men moving through a landscape they did not fully understand, trying to accomplish tasks that were becoming increasingly difficult as resistance stiffened. One can imagine, if one tries, the perspective of a young British paratrooper moving through Arnhem's streets for the first time, rifle held ready, eyes alert to the windows and doorways of the houses around him. He has been trained, he has jumped from aircraft, he has landed safely, and now he is moving toward what he has been told is his objective. The city around him is largely intact, its buildings still standing, its streets recognizable as the streets of a place where people lived their lives, worked, went about the ordinary business of being human. Yet now, it is becoming a place of gunfire, of danger, of the terrible machinery of war grinding into motion. The first few hours of the 1st Airborne's advance, then, were marked by a kind of gathering tension. The element of surprise was beginning to dissipate. German reaction time, though initially delayed, was shortening with each passing hour. The British forces, initially loose and spread across a wide area, were beginning to concentrate around the approaches to the bridges. There was still a sense, among many of the officers and men, that the objectives could be reached and held until relief arrived. There was still a sense that the operation, despite its vast ambition, could succeed. But that sense was already beginning to erode as the reality of German military capability and the proximity of German forces became clear. What had appeared on maps and in briefings as a bold thrust into enemy territory was becoming a complex, difficult battle against an enemy that, though caught off guard, was beginning to mount an increasingly coherent and determined defense. By the afternoon of that first day, as the German armor began to stir in earnest from the villages surrounding Arnhem, Major John Frost had already accomplished what few believed possible. His paratroopers, barely 2,000 men drawn from the 2nd Battalion of the 1st Airborne, some scattered and lost, others moving with precise discipline through the warming Dutch afternoon, had seized the northern approaches to the great bridge that spanned the Rhine. In the mind of Montgomery and the planners back in England, this bridge was the pivot point. Everything hinged on Frost's men holding it until the ground forces could arrive from the south, breaking through along a single corridor of road, a thread of liberation stretching from the Belgian border all the way to the town's northern edge. The bridge itself was a monument to pre-war engineering. Steel and concrete, a railway bridge and a road bridge running nearly parallel, they soared above the water with a kind of austere grace. Frost had established his headquarters in a schoolhouse close by, from which vantage point he could see the western approaches and hear the sporadic fire that crackled through the town's streets. His men had dug in around the bridge's landing, creating a perimeter in the rubble and buildings nearby. They had ammunition, they had cover, and they had the grim determination that comes from having achieved the impossible and knowing they must not let it slip away. But the town of Arnhem itself, spreading out in all directions from the bridge, was beginning to pulse with German movement, and it was the remnants of the 9th SS Panzer Division Hohenstaufen that began to materialize in the urban maze with increasing urgency as afternoon turned toward evening. The Hohenstaufen's elements near Arnhem had initially scattered during the morning, their commanders scrambling to reassess the situation as the reality sank in that an entire British airborne corps was falling from the sky directly on top of them. By early afternoon, fragments of the division's armor and infantry began to coalesce. There was no grand counter-offensive being orchestrated from above, no reservoir of fresh reserves and fuel trucks arriving on schedule. Instead, there was improvisation born of necessity, the gathering of whatever was mechanically sound, whatever crews were nearest, whatever ammunition could be quickly assembled. A handful of Panther tanks, their long 75mm guns, capable of tearing through the paratroopers' lightly armored jeeps and their soft-skinned lorries. Several companies of SS infantry, many of them veterans of Normandy, men who understood the brutal arithmetic of street fighting, half-tracks, armored personnel carriers with machine guns, the kind of vehicles that could move swiftly through urban terrain and concentrate fire on a fixed position. The question that Frost must have pondered in those quiet moments between bursts of gunfire was whether these men, these German soldiers arriving piecemeal through the town's commercial district and residential streets, understood yet the full magnitude of what they faced. Did they know that the entire purpose of this operation was to drive past Arnhem toward the north, to break through German lines and wheel around the Ruhr? Or did they see only local resistance, airborne troops to be rounded up and eliminated as a threat to their division's integrity? The distinction mattered because it shaped how fiercely they would fight. By late afternoon, the first serious German pressure against Frost's perimeter began to build. The street fighting that ensued was not the sweeping mobile warfare of armoured advance across open ground, but rather the grinding, building by building, room by room contest that reduces combat to its most intimate and exhausting form. The paratroopers, lightly armed with rifles and Bren guns, with some anti-tank rifles that could penetrate German armour if the range and angle were right, had the advantage of prepared positions. They had time to observe the approaches, time to choose their fields of fire, time to consolidate their defences. Yet the Germans, with their superiority in armour and automatic weapons, possessed the ability to pour firepower into those prepared positions from multiple directions simultaneously. The afternoon light was beginning to soften as the first Panther tanks were reported moving cautiously into the northern and western approaches to the bridge. Their commanders, operating with the caution of men who knew that airborne troops often carried anti-tank weapons, advanced slowly, pausing to rake buildings with machine gun fire, waiting for their supporting infantry to clear potential ambush positions. And as they did, there came that peculiar sound that characterizes urban combat in the 20th century, the metallic percussion of bullets striking steel, the deeper crack of armor-piercing rounds, the hollow boom of tank guns, all echoing off the stone facades of civilian buildings, mixing with the shouts of men and the mechanical whine of engines in low gear. It is striking, when one examines the casualty figures and the accounts left behind, how much punishment Frost's perimeter absorbed without collapsing. The Germans were not attempting a single overwhelming assault. They seemed to be testing, probing, feeling out the strength of the British positions. Perhaps they expected the paratroopers to break. Perhaps they believed that the sight of German armour on their streets would be sufficient to convince Frost that his situation was untenable. If so, they had misunderstood their opponent. Frost was a man of remarkable calm under fire, a professional soldier with considerable experience, and he possessed the kind of stoicism that comes from understanding that surrender meant the end of the possibility of victory. His men, watching his demeanour, mirrored it. They held their fire until targets were clear. They rationed their ammunition. They did not panic when German fire raked their positions. As darkness began to settle over Arnhem on that first evening, the street fighting took on a different character. Visibility contracted sharply. The Germans' advantage in firepower became somewhat less overwhelming when targets could not be clearly seen. The paratroopers' ability to hold positions through careful observation transformed into something more like a blind vigil, waiting in the darkness for movement, for sound, for the shape of a vehicle emerging from shadow. Tank crews, operating in an environment they could not fully see, became more cautious still, working with their infantry to clear streets methodically rather than attempting bold mechanized thrusts. Yet even as darkness provided some temporary relief, the situation was inexorably shifting against Frost's men. The Hohenstaufen was gathering more units, more armor, more infantry, piece by piece, throughout the night and into the early morning hours. And there was another, perhaps more critical reality, asserting itself with each passing hour: the main body of the British 1st Airborne Division, the thousands of paratroopers who had jumped and glided in that first wave, were not linking up with Frost at the bridge. Some had been scattered by the drop zones, which were located at some distance from the town itself. Others had run into German opposition in the suburbs and surrounding villages. The divisions and brigades that should have been driving toward the bridge to reinforce Frost's position were being ground down, delayed, and increasingly isolated in a widening belt of German resistance that stretched across the dropping zones and the approach roads into Arnhem proper. So as the first night wore on, Frost was not merely holding a bridge against German pressure, He was holding a bridge while his reinforcements failed to materialize. He was holding a bridge while his supplies, inevitably depleted by combat, could not be replenished. He was holding a bridge in the knowledge that every hour that passed brought more German armor and more German infantry into the ring that was slowly and methodically tightening around the town. And he would continue to hold it with a kind of quiet heroism that the historical record would later celebrate, but that in those dark hours was simply the determination of a professional soldier and his men to fulfill their mission until it became physically impossible to do so. The machines of war that rumbled through those Dutch streets in mid-September carried their own peculiar history, shaped by 5 years of continuous refinement and the particular needs of an army fighting across 2 continents. The Panther tank, which formed the backbone of both the 9th and 10th SS Panzer Divisions, represented perhaps the closest thing Nazi Germany produced to a truly balanced design, a machine born not from ideology, but from hard lessons learned in the grinding campaigns of Russia and North Africa. It was neither the most heavily armored nor the most agile, but it occupied that rare middle ground where protection, firepower, and mobility spoke to one another in a language the German engineers understood deeply. The Panther's sloped armor, angled at 60 degrees on the glacis plate, could deflect shells that would have punched through earlier designs with almost contemptuous ease. Its 75mm gun fired a round capable of penetrating the frontal armor of most Allied tanks at distances well beyond what those tanks could reply with any hope of success. And yet there was a quality to the Panther that haunted its reputation, even among those who crewed them, a certain fragility in the transmission, a tendency toward mechanical failure at critical moments, as if the machine carried within it some small, patient vulnerability that no amount of engineering prowess could quite suppress. These tanks, however, were never going to arrive at Arnhem in the numbers that doctrine demanded. Both divisions had been bled white in Normandy, their tank strength reduced to perhaps 60 operational panzers between them when they settled into their rest areas near the Rhine. Picture, if you will, the particular mathematics of exhaustion that German commanders faced in September 1944, not simply a shortage of machines, but a shortage of replacement crews, a shortage of fuel, a shortage of spare parts that could no longer flow reliably from German factories. The 9th and 10th SS had to make do with what remained, to improvise, to stretch their resources across distances that seemed to grow wider each day. Some of the tank crews had been together since Russia, others were green, replacements who had arrived only weeks before Operation Market Garden fell upon them. To what extent this mixture of veteran and novice would affect their performance in the narrow streets of Arnhem remained, as yet, unknowable, written into a future that had not yet begun to unfold. Alongside the tanks moved the half-tracks, those curious hybrid machines that occupied an almost meditative space between truck and armored vehicle. The SDKFZ 25-1, the standard German armored personnel carrier, could carry a full squad of 10 men plus its crew, and it could do so while crossing rough ground at speeds that motorized infantry could never match. The sides were high enough to offer some protection from small arms fire, the roof was open to the air and to observation, and inside those metal walls rode the men who would have to assault fortified positions with nothing but rifles, machine pistols, and hand grenades. There was something almost vulnerable about the design when one considered what awaited inside during the fighting. No way out but forward or backward through the narrow doors at the rear, no escape hatch when the machine came under fire from multiple directions. The crews of these vehicles knew this with an understanding that lived in their bodies rather than in any formal acknowledgement. They had experienced it in Russia, in the blockade of Normandy, in the grinding, slow death of mechanized warfare, where progress was measured in hundreds of meters and paid for in lives spent like currency. The Germans had also brought with them, distributed across their formations, an array of heavier anti-tank guns, the Pak-40 and the Pak-43, formidable weapons that could stand off at a distance and methodically destroy armor from beyond the effective range of tank guns. These were not mobile, they had to be positioned, prepared, and defended by infantry, and they represented a different kind of thinking about warfare, a recognition that sometimes firepower had to be static, concentrated, defended in place rather than mobile and fluid. They would play a crucial role in the fighting around Arnhem, particularly in the early days when the German defenders were trying to stabilize their positions and prevent the British airborne forces from breaking through toward the bridge. Interspersed among these more formal weapons systems were the countless improvisations that emerge in every prolonged campaign. Captured guns, field-expedient anti-tank rifles, machine gun nests constructed from sandbags and rubble, Panzerfaust hand anti-tank rockets pressed into the hands of infantry squads to give them at least some means of defending themselves against enemy armor. These humble weapons, these desperate measures, would prove to be the equalizers in much of the fighting, allowing men armed with nothing but explosive charges and courage to stand against machines that were, on paper, far their superior. The Panzerfaust in particular, a single-use, shoulder-fired rocket launcher that was cheap to manufacture and devastatingly effective, represented a kind of democratic weaponization of anti-armor capability. A private soldier, armed with one of these devices, became for a brief moment a tank killer, capable of inflicting catastrophic damage on machines worth 50 times his annual salary. What does it do to a man's understanding of warfare, one might wonder, to find that his own courage and proximity matter more than the formal hierarchy of armor and firepower? The German soldiers who carried Panzerfausts into the streets of Arnhem understood this intuitively. They had learned it, many of them, in the terrible crucible of urban combat in Russian cities. The armored cars and reconnaissance vehicles scattered throughout both divisions served as the nervous system of the German response. The 8-wheeled SD KFZ, 234 variants, armored and mobile enough to conduct forward reconnaissance, but not so heavily armored that they invited frontal engagement with serious anti-tank weapons. These vehicles would probe forward through the morning and afternoon of September 17th, seeking to understand the scope of the Allied landing, to locate concentrations of airborne troops, to report back to divisional headquarters the details that would shape the German response. Speed and information mattered enormously in those early hours. The side that could gather intelligence fastest would have the first opportunity to move decisively. And everywhere, distributed throughout both divisions, were the machine guns, Maschinengewehr 42s and 34s, weapons of such sustained firepower that they seemed almost alive in the hands of their crews, capable of generating such volume of fire that men moving through open ground seemed to be advancing against a living wall of bullets. These weapons, more than tanks, more than artillery, shaped the texture of combat in those narrow Dutch streets and the surrounding villages. A single well-placed machine gun could hold an entire street, could pin down a company of infantry, could extract an enormous price for every meter of progress. The Germans understood this mathematics with painful clarity, and they deployed their machine guns with an almost surgical precision, placing them at key intersections, at the approaches to bridges, at the natural defensive positions that emerged from the urban landscape itself. What emerges from this inventory is not a picture of overwhelming German strength, but rather a more subtle and more complex reality, a force that was materially constrained, creatively adaptive, and possessed of weapon systems that were individually sophisticated but collectively hampered by the scarcity of fuel, ammunition, and trained personnel. The two divisions that would face the British 1st Airborne in those terrible days of September were neither the fresh panzer formations that had rolled through France in 1940, nor the worn remnants that would exist by spring of 1945. They occupied a middle space, a moment of exhaustion but not yet collapse, when skill and desperation could still accomplish things that seemed impossible on paper. The machines they commanded were formidable, yes, but machines are only as effective as the men who operate them, and the men of the 9th and 10th SS Panzer Divisions, for all their training and ideology, were mortals who could be tired, afraid, wounded, and killed just as surely as the men who opposed them. Once the German column under Kraft and his subordinates began to push into Arnhem's brick and stone corridors, the nature of the fighting transformed entirely. This was no longer open ground where armor could maneuver freely or artillery could work its terrible arithmetic across distance. The town itself became the fortress, room by room, street by street, a three-dimensional puzzle where every window held a possibility and every doorway a threshold of uncertainty. The British paratroopers of the 1st and 3rd Battalions, having fought through the outskirts with remarkable coordination, despite shortages of heavy weapons, now found themselves compressed into neighborhoods they had not fully expected to defend. Arnhem's architecture, a layering of medieval and more recent construction, narrow alleys winding between structures, created natural compartments where men could hold ground with limited numbers but at tremendous cost to their own endurance. What had seemed like simple blocks from a map became, in reality, dense mazes where communication between positions grew difficult and the sense of an organized line dissolved into something far more fragmented. The soldiers advancing through these streets, both the German reinforcements and the British paratroopers who held them, moved with a caution born of knowing that danger could materialize from almost anywhere. A window on the 2nd floor, a basement corner, the space between two buildings where a man could hide in shadow. What historians sometimes reduce to arrows on a map was, in those moments, the slow, methodical process of men clearing rooms, of calling to one another, of deciding when to move and when to wait. There was little of the romantic charge one might imagine. Instead, there was the exhaustion of sustained alertness, the weight of a rifle held ready for hours, the dry mouth and the pounding heart that comes from uncertainty. The German soldiers, many of them younger men who had been through France and the retreat, understood that they held a numerical and material advantage that would only grow as more units filtered into the town. But they also understood that the British were trained paratroopers, men with particular skills in close-quarters movement and defensive positioning. Conversations between officers and NCOs, insofar as we can piece them together from accounts that survived the decades, reveal a respect for their adversaries that transcended the ideology separating them. This was not a fight between abstractions. It was men encountering other men, and that recognition created a strange, quiet gravity to proceedings. The Dutch civilians trapped in the fighting faced a different species of horror entirely. Families huddled in basements and cellars, listening to the sound of gunfire from above, the smell of cordite filtering down, the intermittent shout of voices in German or English, the unknown and ever-present question of whether the next shell or burst of machine gun fire would find them. Many had lived through earlier bombardments and invasions. The knowledge that war had come to their doorstep again, that the brief stability following the liberation was now shattered, added its own weight to the fear and discomfort. The fighting itself, when it occurred, often took on the character of sharp, localized encounters rather than sustained engagements. A British position held in a church basement or a converted shop might exchange fire with a German patrol for several minutes, then settle into tense watching as each side assessed the other's strength. The Waffen-SS soldiers, particularly those from the Hohenstaufen, brought a level of training and cohesion that made them formidable, though they were also operating in unfamiliar urban terrain and against opponents whose discipline they could not easily match. The paratroops, by contrast, were fighting from increasingly constrained ground, their ammunition supply becoming a constant concern, yet buoyed by a kind of quiet professionalism that came from elite training and the knowledge that they were fighting to achieve a specific objective. As the hours accumulated into days, the fighting settled into a rhythm of its own. The initial shock and intensity of the first contacts gave way to a grinding pattern of small engagements, defensive improvements, movement through rubble, and the constant calculation of diminishing resources. The town's buildings, many of them centuries old, bore the incremental marks of this conflict: bullet holes stippling brick, windows blown inward, doorways widened by explosives to provide access between structures. Each mark represented a moment of decision, a split second where men chose to fire or to move or to wait. The phenomenon of urban fighting, it should be noted, creates particular strains on both attacker and defender. Visibility is limited. Sound behaves unpredictably in narrow spaces. Radio communication, on which modern military units depend, becomes unreliable amid the interference of buildings and the acoustic chaos of gunfire in enclosed areas. Officers found themselves unable to maintain the contact with subordinate units they would have expected in open terrain. This fragmentation meant that decisions about movement, fire discipline, and tactical positioning fell to junior leaders and sometimes to individual soldiers, men who were doing their best with incomplete information and exhaustion mounting steadily. The water supply in Arnhem, as in most surrounded cities, became a concern of increasing urgency. Soldiers and civilians alike faced the mounting thirst that comes with stress and exertion in a contained space. The Germans, with their growing logistical presence in the surrounding area, found it somewhat easier to address this than the British, whose supply lines were already stretched to breaking point. Yet there is little evidence of systematic cruelty in the fighting itself. No organized massacres, no systematic executions of prisoners, though the friction and fear that accompanies urban combat certainly took its toll in moments of brutality born from panic or rage. What emerges from the accounts of those who survived these days in Arnhem is something more complex than simple heroism or villainy. There were acts of courage and foolishness, instances of mercy and anger, the full spectrum of human behavior compressed into a setting where the ordinary rules of civilian life had entirely dissolved. A German medic tending to both his own wounded and British casualties, a British soldier sharing water with a captive, an officer on either side choosing to negotiate a local ceasefire to allow civilians to be evacuated from a particularly contested neighborhood. These small moments of recognizable humanity flickered through the fighting like distant lights in darkness. The noise itself became something that survivors remembered with particular clarity. Not just the sound of gunfire, but the ringing that followed it, the muffled sense of hearing that came with exposure to explosions, the way conversations had to be conducted in raised voices, the smell of smoke and burnt powder mixed with the autumn air and the dust of shattered masonry, the taste of it, grainy on the tongue. These sensory details, seemingly irrelevant to the military history of the operation, were in many ways its essence, the physical reality of what the men involved were enduring. As the third day of fighting gave way to the fourth, the Germans had successfully compressed the British defensive positions into an ever tighter perimeter. The British, meanwhile, clung to their presence in the town with a determination that surprised their opponents and, frankly, kept them from being overwhelmed faster than they were. But the mathematics of the situation were becoming undeniable. More German units were arriving. The British had received no substantial reinforcement. Ammunition was rationed. Wounded men accumulated with no way to evacuate them. The question was no longer whether the British would be defeated, but rather when, and under what circumstances, that defeat would be negotiated. While the Hohenstaufen division remained locked in the streets of Arnhem itself, fighting through block after block with what little armor and ammunition they could scrape together, another current of German response was already flowing south toward Nijmegen. The 10th SS Panzer Division Frundsberg, commanded by Brigadeführer Heinz Harmel, had received their marching orders from General Bittrich mere hours after the first parachutes bloomed across the September sky. Their task was singular and urgent: race to the Nijmegen bridges before the American 82nd Airborne Division could secure them and hold them at any cost. The Frundsberg was, in many ways, the mirror image of the Hohenstaufen, equally bloodied by Normandy, equally depleted of veteran strength, yet somehow still possessed of that peculiar drive that characterized the panzer divisions in their final season of warfare. Harmel himself was a figure of some interest to his men, a career officer who had actually commanded the division since its formation, a man who understood its capabilities and its terrible limitations with equal clarity. On that September afternoon, as the division's scattered units began to concentrate on the roads south from the Arnhem area, they faced the same cascading problems that plagued every German formation in those desperate days: fuel in short supply, replacement crews undertrained, communications frayed between company and battalion. Yet the orders came nonetheless, and the wheels began to turn. Picture, if you will, the countryside between Arnhem and Nijmegen in those middle hours of September 17th, a landscape of wide agricultural flatness, punctuated by small towns and villages, bisected by narrow roads and waterways that would become, for the next few days, the skeleton of a grinding contest. The Frundsberg's route south took them through Elst, a modest town that would assume an unexpected strategic importance, and then on toward the approaches to Nijmegen itself, where the great Waal River crossing dominated all movement and created a natural choke point that neither side could afford to lose. It was perhaps 40 kilometers from their assembly areas, but in those September days, with air attacks a constant threat and transportation assets stretched impossibly thin, every kilometer consumed fuel and time with the same relentless hunger. The American paratroopers of the 82nd Airborne Division had their own objectives, of course. Their orders called for the seizure of the Nijmegen bridges, both the road bridge and the railway bridge that spanned the Waal, along with control of the high ground at Groesbeek and a sector of the Dutch-German border. It was an ambitious undertaking for troops who had landed in dispersed fashion, often far from their drop zones, and whose immediate situation remained fluid and uncertain in those first hours. Yet among the American paratroopers, there was a particular confidence, a sense that they had surprised the Germans, that momentum lay with them, and that rapid movement would be the key to seizing their objectives before German forces could concentrate. This confidence was not unreasonable, but it had not fully accounted for the Frundsberg division, now in motion through the September afternoon. What followed, over the next 36 hours, was a race rendered in the currency of lives and gasoline and the grinding attrition of piecemeal engagement. The Frundsberg did not attack in the orderly, concentrated fashion that peacetime doctrine might have suggested. Instead, their commander threw forward what he had: reconnaissance troops, motorcycle platoons, anti-tank guns mounted on half-tracks, infantry squads traveling by truck or on foot, all moving in loose columns toward the sound of American gunfire and the sight of parachute canopies still settling in fields and hedgerows. The German command structure, for all its legendary rigidity, possessed a certain flexibility in moments of crisis, and junior officers and NCOs found themselves making decisions that in any other circumstance would have required multiple layers of approval. It was a form of organized chaos, but it was chaos in motion, and motion was what mattered. The first contacts were necessarily small affairs: a Frundsberg reconnaissance squad encountering American paratroopers in a village, a half-company of German engineers setting up a roadblock that would delay an American company for 2 or 3 vital hours, isolated actions that meant little in themselves, but cumulatively created what military historians call friction. And friction, in those first days around Nijmegen, favored the side that was already in position, already concentrated, already prepared to absorb delay and convert it into defensive advantage. The Americans found themselves fighting for roads they had expected to move along freely, for villages that should have been empty or lightly held, but which now bristled with improvised German defenses and small strongpoints. Each delay, seemingly minor in the moment, accumulated into the loss of hours of daylight, the loss of momentum, the loss of that precious window when surprise still retained its power. One might pause here and reflect on the strange mathematics of warfare, how a division that was arguably not combat capable in any conventional sense, whose replacement personnel had not trained together, whose armor was a patchwork of captured vehicles and older models, whose fuel supply was measured in anxious hours rather than days, could nonetheless prove sufficient to upset the calculations of a much better resourced opponent. It was not that the Frundsberg was strong, but rather that they were strong enough, positioned correctly, and moving with sufficient rapidity to contest the space that their enemies needed. In military affairs, one learns, there is often more truth in questions of timing and placement than in questions of raw capability. The Frundsberg had neither the strength nor the certainty of supply to hold Nijmegen indefinitely, but they did not need to hold it indefinitely. They only needed to hold it long enough for other formations to arrive, for German command to establish a continuous front, for the initial German collapse to be arrested and transformed into something resembling a coordinated defense. The dash down from Arnhem consumed the afternoon and evening of September 17th, and as darkness fell, the German units began to settle into whatever positions they could establish. Small arms fire crackled from village to village. Anti-tank guns, carefully husbanded and positioned by Frundsberg commanders who understood their value as the only meaningful response to enemy armor, dug into hedgerows and at road junctions. The Vaal River, still some distance to the south, gleamed in the starlight like a promise of security, a river that could be defended, a barrier that would impose order on the chaos. Around Nijmegen itself, in the early hours of darkness on September 17th and 18th, a grinding containment began to take shape. Not an encirclement, not yet, but the outline of one. The beginning of the constriction that would ultimately determine the fate of Operation Market Garden in this sector. The Frundsberg Division, exhausted and undersupplied though they were, had begun to transform themselves from a passing shadow into an obstacle, and obstacles have a way of accumulating weight as time passes and more men and material arrive to reinforce them. What made these formations function as coherent instruments of war when their component parts were scattered across a collapsing battlefield, running short of fuel and ammunition and command and control radio? The answer lies not in ideology alone, though that was present, woven into recruitment and training, but in something more quotidian and, in its way, more human: the culture of the officer corps, the weight of military tradition, and the peculiar bind of loyalty that held these divisions together even as the wider Reich crumbled around them. The Waffen-SS, unlike the regular Wehrmacht, was not merely a military institution. It carried within it an ideological mission, a belief system that had been hammered into its ranks from the moment recruits arrived. Yet here is a quiet paradox worth sitting with. The men who commanded the 9th and 10th Panzer Divisions were, many of them, professional soldiers first. Their ideology was genuine, in most cases, but it coexisted with something older and more durable, a code of martial conduct inherited from the Prussian tradition, modified by Nazi training, but recognizably part of an unbroken chain of military culture stretching back through German history. Obersturmbannführer Karl Harzer, who led much of the 9th SS resistance in the streets of Arnhem itself, was a career officer of 34, a veteran of Poland and France, and the long grinding war in Russia. He carried authority not from screamed ideology, but from competence, from having lived through the worst the war could offer and having kept his men alive. Consider the mechanics of discipline within such a formation. Unlike popular imagination, which often paints the SS as a collection of fanatics held together by fear and demagoguery, the reality was far more structured and, in many respects, far more professional. Officers held commissions based on demonstrated ability. Enlisted men were trained in small unit tactics, in the operation of complex machinery, in the coordination of armor and infantry. A panzer grenadier, an armored infantryman, who served with the 9th or 10th, was the product of months of instruction, of live fire exercise, of unit cohesion drills. This was not mere brutality. This was military craft, and it shows in the speed with which these divisions, despite their exhaustion and fragmentation, managed to cohere and respond to the Allied assault on September 17th. But what of the ideology that saturated the ranks? It is necessary to acknowledge it without flinching, and also to resist the flattening impulse to assume it was uniform or all-consuming. The SS, as a state within a state, did recruit on ideological grounds. Its membership was drawn, to some degree, from those convinced of Nazi racial doctrine, of the righteousness of the German cause, of the necessity of the struggle against Bolshevism and other perceived enemies. Training included indoctrination. The SS man was expected to be not merely a competent soldier, but a bearer of the regime's values. Yet even within this system, there existed gradations of belief, of doubt, of weariness. By 1944, after 5 years of war, after the losses of Normandy and the failed offensives in Russia, even committed ideologues felt the weight of reality pressing against doctrine. The men in the ranks, the ordinary soldiers, the Sturmmänner and Rottenführer, the junior NCOs leading squads, what were they? They ranged widely. Some had been conscripted into the Waffen-SS as the war ground on and the need for manpower became acute. Others were volunteers, convinced or curious, or simply lacking other options. A good number were very young, barely 20, their entire adult consciousness formed under the Third Reich, shaped by Hitler youth camps and the constant drumbeat of state messaging. Yet even the youngest were also, before all else, soldiers. They knew fear. They understood survival. They could recognize good leadership from poor leadership. They could distinguish between an officer who threw lives away recklessly and one who managed the brutal calculus of modern warfare with some degree of care for his men. What held these thousands together, as the net tightened around Arnhem, was not single-stranded. Ideology played a role, the belief, genuine or absorbed, that they were fighting for something greater than themselves, or at least that they were German soldiers doing their duty. But equally important was primary group loyalty, the bond between men who had trained together, who had watched comrades die, who depended on each other for survival. A young grenadier in a ruined street in Arnhem was not thinking, in that moment, about the grand designs of the Third Reich. He was thinking about the soldier next to him, about not letting him down, about keeping his head down and making it to the next corner alive. Military culture, ancient and persistent, ran deeper than ideology. The chain of command itself deserves reflection here. The SS officer, let us imagine Hauptsturmführer, a captain, would have received orders from his battalion commander, who in turn answered to the regimental commander, who reported to the divisional commander, and so on up the chain. Yet in the chaos of Arnhem, in the fragmented engagement where enemy airborne soldiers appeared suddenly from buildings and woods and overgrown gardens, the chain often became a network of improvised authority. Platoon sergeants made decisions that would normally belong to officers. Officers took charge of whoever was nearest and capable of fighting, regardless of their formal unit. This flexibility, this ability of the lower ranks to take initiative within broad parameters set by senior leadership, was characteristic of German military culture. A doctrine called Auftragstaktik, mission-oriented tactics, which emphasized the commander's intent over rigid obedience to detailed orders. It meant that even when command and control broke down, the formations could still function, still coordinate, still deliver firepower at the critical moment. Yet in this flexibility lay also a darker dimension. When orders came down to clear a building, to suppress enemy fire from a residential block, to expand a perimeter, officers and NCOs had discretion in how those orders were executed. In the urban warfare of Arnhem, in a town where military lines blurred with civilian existence, that discretion sometimes meant violence inflicted on people who were not armed combatants, or at least not in the moment of action. The Waffen-SS, whatever its professional military qualities, operated within a broader system that had already committed atrocities on an industrial scale. The men of the 9th and 10th Panzer Divisions were not, by and large, concentration camp guards or members of killing squads. They were infantry and armor soldiers engaged in conventional combat. Yet they were part of a machine that served a criminal state, and that service, however compartmentalized in their minds, carried within it a residue of moral complicity that no amount of professional military virtue could entirely erase. How did the men themselves understand their position? This is perhaps where the documentary impulse must acknowledge the limits of its own knowledge. We cannot entirely climb into the consciousness of a 23-year-old SS Panzer Grenadier in September 1944, cannot fully know whether he had doubts, what he believed, how he reconciled the military code he lived by, with the larger purposes to which that military force was being directed. We have testimony, of course, memoirs, interviews, correspondence, but these are filtered through decades, shaped by later understanding and regret, or by continuing conviction, or by carefully neutral professional recounting. What we can say is that the culture of these formations was complex, that the men who comprised them were not cardboard villains but human beings, shaped by history and circumstance, operating within constraints of military discipline and ideological pressure, making moment-by-moment choices in conditions of extreme stress and incomplete information. The 9th SS Hohenstaufen and the 10th SS Frundsberg held together at Arnhem not because of a single cause, but because of the interlocking elements of military tradition, professional competence, ideological conviction, primary group loyalty, and the simple fact that soldiers in combat tend to follow orders and stay with their units because the alternative, breaking formation, fleeing, is even more frightening and likely more fatal. The men fought, they coordinated, they brought their armor and firepower to bear at key points. They stopped the British drive to the bridge, contained the airborne forces, and eventually forced a German victory at Arnhem, despite their exhaustion and despite the thinness of their strength. How one judges that victory, what moral weight one assigns to it, is a question each listener must answer for themselves. But the mechanism by which it occurred, the way military organization, training, culture, and the peculiar binding force of hierarchy and loyalty allowed scattered, undermanned formations to cohere and act, that is worth understanding clearly and without the distortion of sentiment or ideology. By the evening of the 17th, as darkness settled across the Dutch landscape and church bells ceased their pealing, the outer edges of the British perimeter had already begun to contract. The paratroopers of the 1st Airborne Division found themselves no longer advancing through Oosterbeek with the momentum of surprise, but rather settling into defensive positions around the small, tree-lined town, digging in behind gardens and farm walls, their parachute silk caught in the branches above them, like the ghosts of hope now fading into the September dusk. The German noose, though invisible at first, was drawing tighter with each passing hour, each passing day, as the Waffen-SS divisions, now fully mobilized, their scattered companies consolidated into fighting groups, began to encircle what had become, almost overnight, a shrinking island of red berets and British determination in the midst of occupied Holland. The Hohenstaufen division, working with methodical German discipline, had by September 18th begun to consolidate its forces on the northern and eastern approaches to Oosterbeek. Their losses were severe, ammunition trucks still missing, tank strength depleted, men exhausted from forced marches and night movements. Yet the very fact of their presence, their heavy weapons, their armor moving ponderously through the narrow Dutch streets, was enough to squeeze the perimeter inward. And on the southern flank, the Frundsberg division, having fought its way southward against the Americans at Nijmegen, was now wheeling back northward, moving to seal off any possible escape route or reinforcement corridor that the British might hope to exploit. The paratroopers, it seems worth reflecting, had been promised that the Second Army would break through to their positions within 2 or 3 days. Those days were slipping away, and the German ring was growing thicker, more organized, more suffocating with each dawn. By September 19th and 20th, the picture had crystallized into something grimly familiar to those who had witnessed the encirclement of other airborne forces throughout the war. The British found themselves concentrated in an area no more than 3 or 4 miles across, with approximately 7,000 combat troops, though that number was already diminishing through casualties, packed into gardens, orchards, and the narrow confines of houses and ruined buildings. The Germans, working with increasing confidence and coordination, began to establish strongpoints on the perimeter's edge, grinding away at the British defences with artillery, mortar fire, and machine gun barrages that came in waves, tireless and patient. The noise of battle became almost constant, a dull, rhythmic thunder punctuated by the sharper crack of small arms fire and the occasional rumble of German armour moving to new positions. What is perhaps most striking when one examines the German tactical approach during these middle days of the Oosterbeek pocket, is the absence of any hurried, desperate assault. The Germans seem to understand, and one might wonder whether Model's headquarters and Bittrick's experienced staff recognized this instinctively, that time itself was now a weapon far more powerful than any tank or machine gun. The British were surrounded, their supply lines severed, their medical facilities overwhelmed, their ammunition reserves quietly depleting with each passing hour of defensive fire. All the Germans had to do was maintain pressure, prevent any breakout, prevent any breakthrough from the south, and wait. The British would, in a sense, strangle themselves, their options narrowing day by day, their strength ebbing away like the September daylight itself. The tightening of the ring manifested in countless small, grinding ways, difficult to narrate without slipping into the granular catalogue of suffering, yet important to understand in order to grasp how a modern army, trained, equipped, well led, could find itself not defeated in open battle, but rather slowly compressed, suffocated, reduced to survival itself rather than victory. Supply drops became increasingly difficult and dangerous. The British had managed to establish a small drop zone in the Oosterbeek perimeter, but the German anti-aircraft fire and the simple logistical difficulty of coordinating supply missions from England meant that far too often parachuted ammunition and food fell into German hands or landed beyond the perimeter's shrinking boundaries. The paratroopers found themselves rationing ammunition, rationing water, performing surgery with morphine supplies that were running low. The wounded accumulated in captured buildings, in cellars, in improvised aid stations, where stretcher-bearers moved through the gathering gloom with that peculiar exhaustion that comes not from the exertion of a single moment, but from days of relentless, grinding tension. German artillery, once the paratroopers had settled into fixed positions, became increasingly effective. The German gunners, working from maps and from the accumulated knowledge of German officers who had served in the area or knew it from previous operations, began to register fire on known British strongpoints, on the drop zone, on the positions where men were known to gather or water to be drawn. The British had virtually no counter-battery capability. Their light artillery pieces, dropped with the assault echelons, had been consumed in the intensity of the first 3 days of fighting or had run out of ammunition. The Germans possessed, despite their shortages and their losses at Normandy, an abundance of artillery, and they used it with a patience that was, perhaps, more demoralizing than any sudden assault could have been. Shells falling on the same garden twice a day, shells falling on the improvised hospital, shells falling on the positions where men tried to scratch out latrines and brew tea from melted snow. The perimeter, one should understand, was never a clean line, never a neatly drawn circle on a map. Instead, it was a ragged, irregular boundary, shaped by terrain, by the positions of buildings and trees, by where German strongpoints had been established and where British resistance had managed to hold. In some places, the opposing forces were no more than a street or two apart, separated by rubble and by the kind of no-man's land that is familiar to anyone who has studied the urban warfare of the 20th century. German infantry, working in small groups, probing forward, testing the British lines, seeking weak points, would occasionally penetrate the perimeter's edge, only to be driven back by counterattacks or accurate British rifle fire. These were not large actions, not the kind of thing that would merit a regimental account, but rather small, vicious, exhausting struggles for a single crossroads or a cluster of houses. The Hohenstaufen and Frundsberg divisions, by this point several days into the operation, were beginning to coordinate their efforts with a precision that suggested high-level command attention. Model's headquarters, still present in the area, was exercising overall command, and there are indications, though the historical record becomes somewhat murky here, as it often does with German military decisions under extreme pressure, that the SS divisional commanders were receiving orders not simply to contain the British, but to prepare for a final assault that would break the perimeter entirely and bring about the complete surrender or annihilation of the 1st Airborne Division. German reinforcements, though small, were continuing to arrive. Machine gun companies and anti-tank teams were being ferried in from other fronts. from damaged units, from replacement depots scattered throughout the occupied territories. Each one represented another weight pressing down on the British perimeter, another small increment of pressure in what must have felt like the inexorable compression of a vise. By September 22nd, the British held what the historical records refer to as the Oosterbeek pocket, though pocket seems almost too formal a term for what was essentially a surrounded position of desperate men clinging to a few square miles of Dutch ground. The Germans held the outer ring, growing thicker, more established with each passing day. Artillery positions had been surveyed and registered, machine gun nests had been fortified, tank crews, rotating through their assignments, had become familiar with the routes to various sections of the perimeter. The SS divisions were functioning, despite their losses and their logistical difficulties, as coherent military organizations, and that coherence, that ability to coordinate across divisional boundaries, to concentrate force at chosen points, to maintain supplies and communications despite the chaos of active operations, was beginning to assert itself as a decisive advantage. The British, meanwhile, were beginning to face questions that have haunted airborne forces throughout history. When relief does not come, when the perimeter is surrounded by forces you cannot break through, what is the calculus of continued resistance? At what point does the continuation of a hopeless fight become merely the prolongation of suffering? By the fourth day of fighting, the bridge had become a tomb. Not in the sense of death alone, though death had visited it countless times across those 96 hours, but in the deeper sense of a place where time itself seemed to have stopped, where the urgency that had driven the first British paratroopers across those girders had calcified into something else entirely: exhaustion, resignation, the slow recognition that mathematics had turned against them. John Frost, the major who had led the seizure of the bridge with such precision and such hope, now commanded something closer to a besieged garrison than an advancing force. Around him, the men under his direct command, perhaps 800 souls by the morning of September 21st, though the count had become uncertain, held the northern approaches to the bridge in a honeycomb of damaged buildings, cellar strongpoints, and barricaded rooms where every window had become a firing position. The Waffen-SS divisions surrounding them had, in those 4 days, transformed from scattered battle groups into an increasingly coherent noose. SS Hauptsturmführer Grabner's reconnaissance company and the 1st Hohenstaufen units had arrived on the evening of the 17th with such force that they had nearly thrown the British off the bridge in those first hours. But Frost and his men had held. They had held through the night of the 17th. They had held through the 18th, when German armor had moved into the town and the streets had become rivers of fire. They had held through the 19th and 20th as German soldiers, many of them hardened veterans from Normandy, many of them fighting with the peculiar tenacity that came from understanding, consciously or not, that the Reich they had sworn to serve was already dying, had pressed inward from every direction. The Hohenstaufen's commander, SS Brigadeführer Heinz Harmel, had coordinated the pressure with methodical care. He had no interest in a frontal assault up the bridge approach that would waste armor and men. Instead, he had compressed the pocket, cut the British off from resupply, silenced their radio communications when possible, and allowed the simple arithmetic of attrition to work itself upon them. By the morning of the 21st, Frost himself was no longer mobile. A shell fragment had lodged in his spine during the night, and he lay in a cellar aid post, conscious, lucid, but unable to move his legs. Around him, his remaining officers moved through a kind of dreamlike vigilance, awake beyond the point of exhaustion, running on something more ancient than adrenaline, a simple refusal to stop functioning. The men in the rubble above him were in worse condition. Ammunition was almost gone. Medical supplies had run dry the previous evening. The German artillery, now coordinated across the Hohenstaufen's available guns, had turned the bridge and its surroundings into a landscape of collapsed facades and smouldering streets. Oberführer Franz Kosling, commanding one of the Hohenstaufen battle groups, had moved a Tiger tank forward to within direct line of sight of the British strongpoint. The psychological weight of that armor alone, The knowledge that an 88mm gun, one of the war's most fearsome anti-tank weapons, was trained upon their position, had its own subtle erosive effect upon morale. Frost's decision, when it came in the early afternoon of September 21st, was not made in haste or despair, though despair had every reason to be present. It was made with the clarity of a commander who understood that his men had reached the limit of human endurance, and that to push beyond that limit was no longer duty, but cruelty. He had held the bridge for 96 hours with a force increasingly bereft of ammunition, medical supplies, and any realistic hope of reinforcement. The British Second Army's advance from the south had become bogged down near Nijmegen, held up by the very Frundsberg division that had blocked them. The American paratroopers in the town itself were hard-pressed. Arnhem had never been relieved, and all signs pointed toward the certainty that it would not be. In the cellar, his legs useless, his command reduced to perhaps 200 fit fighting men, Frost gave the order that would send a white flag up over the bridge. There was no ceremony to it, no final speech, no moment of theatre. A British officer walked toward the German lines with a white cloth, and the endless sound of small arms fire that had become the ambient noise of the bridge, gradually, sector by sector, fell silent. The German soldiers who moved forward after that flag appeared found what fighting units find after extended combat: living men too exhausted to stand, wounded men lying in positions they had held for days, and rubble that had become so thoroughly intermixed with human presence that it was difficult to say where the structure ended and the suffering began. Some of the German paratroopers who took the bridge, for it was parachute units among the SS, soldiers with their own combat fatigue and their own reasons for pushing forward, showed restraint. Others showed the kind of weary indifference that comes when one has been fighting continuously and has simply run out of emotional capacity for anything beyond the mechanical processes of securing prisoners and terrain. Frost was carried out on a stretcher. He would spend the remainder of the war in a German hospital, and then in captivity, his spine fractured, his immediate future measured not in years, but in whether he would walk again. The British soldiers, those who were able to stand, began the slow procession into captivity. Some would be marched into the interior of Germany. Others would be held in the Arnhem area until the German collapse itself, remaining in a kind of twilight existence as the war's end approached. It would be easy to narrate this moment as a German victory, and in the strictly military sense, it was. Frost and his men had been forced to surrender. The bridge had not been held. The German armour and soldiers had proven more numerous and more capable than the isolated British force. But there exists a peculiar quality to certain tactical moments in war where the simple facts of military success do not quite capture the deeper reality of what has occurred. Frost and his men had held the bridge for 4 days against a German division specifically tasked with its defence. They had inflicted casualties upon the Hohenstaufen that the Germans could ill afford. They had prevented German armour from using the bridge, had forced the Wehrmacht to move river crossings elsewhere, had disrupted the entire German defensive posture in the area. That they had ultimately been overwhelmed was less a reflection of their weakness than a reflection of the mathematical reality that men without ammunition, without reinforcement, and without the ability to maneuver cannot hold territory indefinitely against a well-equipped opponent. The silence that followed the fall of the bridge, the sudden absence of the sustained, almost rhythmic crackle of rifle fire, must have been strange to both the British soldiers lying in the rubble and to the German soldiers moving through it. For 4 days, that sound had been the measure of existence, and now it was gone. What remained was the sound of wind moving through broken windows, the groaning of injured men, the low voices of German soldiers calling out positions and reporting numbers, and underneath it all, perhaps, the faint ongoing murmur of the Rhine, indifferent to empires, to divisions, to the millions of human beings caught in the machinery of their nation's ambitions. The river had flowed in exactly the same way when the war was young, and it would flow in exactly the same way when the war was old, carrying the leaves of autumn toward the sea, as it had carried them before, and as it would carry them again. The perimeter around Oosterbeek, had become a shrinking island of resistance, each day bringing the German ring tighter, each night a kind of mercy in the darkness, where men could count their remaining ammunition and wonder if the next sunrise would come. By the 23rd of September, the pocket had contracted to perhaps 2 square kilometers, a patchwork of British and Polish positions held in bombed buildings, behind rubble, in the gardens and lanes of what had been a quiet Dutch town. The Waffen-SS divisions, now more experienced in what they were facing, pressed methodically inward, and the question that haunted every British officer was not whether they could hold, but whether anyone was coming to help them. General Urquhart and his staff had begun, in those cramped headquarters in the Hartenstein Hotel, to contemplate what had once seemed unthinkable, that the airborne force might have to withdraw. The gliders had brought no fresh supplies for days. The ammunition was rationed down to careful counts. Wounded men lay in cellars and courtyards, some of them beyond what the exhausted medical officers could do with whatever remained in their kits. The relief force from the south, the 9th Corps pushing north from Nijmegen, seemed stalled, unable to break through the German defences that held the corridor of the road. For the men in the positions, the waiting became its own form of torture. They were soldiers, trained and disciplined, yet the accumulated exhaustion of 8 or 9 days of continuous combat begins to blur the edges of consciousness, to make time move strangely. A soldier who has not slept more than an hour or two in succession, who has fought and dug in and fought again, exists in a peculiar state, alert yet dreaming, aware yet somehow distant from the reality of shells and bullets. Some men spoke in whispers of going home. Others simply stared at nothing, their eyes following thoughts that had retreated far from the Oosterbeek perimeter. The German command, meanwhile, sensed that they might squeeze the remaining British forces into surrender without further costly assaults. The Waffen-SS units, particularly the 9th Panzer Division Hohenstaufen under Wilhelm Bittrich, understood that time was now their ally. They could afford to wait, to consolidate, to maintain pressure, without throwing away lives on frontal attacks through rubble. There was a grim calculus to it, a recognition that the British were finished, even if they did not yet acknowledge it to themselves. And then, on the morning of the 25th, after 8 days of fighting that had worn away nearly half of the force that had landed, the decision was made. General Urquhart and his commanders resolved to conduct an evacuation, not a retreat, a word that carried different weight, but a fighting withdrawal across the lower Rhine, from Oosterbeek back to the southern bank where British forces were consolidating. It was perhaps the only choice left, yet it was also an acknowledgement that Operation Market Garden, that ambitious plan to seize the bridges and wheel east into Germany, had failed. The evacuation began in darkness. The planners had chosen the night of the 25th to the 26th, a window when German artillery might be less accurate, when the confusion of darkness could help conceal what was happening. Sappers of the Royal Engineers had identified the crossing points, narrow stretches of river where small boats and rafts could ferry men across the slow, dark water. The operation required a kind of miraculous coordination, holding a perimeter while men filtered backward through the lines, maintaining silence, moving without lights through what had become a landscape of shells and rubble. Soldiers moved in small groups, guided by officers and NCOs, who whispered directions, who kept men steady when fear threatened to undo discipline. Some men carried wounded on stretchers, moving slowly, carefully, aware that a single shout or crash could bring German fire down on the whole column. Others carried what weapons they could manage, having destroyed the rest, a silent protest against an enemy who would not hold them. The night was dark, but not so dark that a soldier could not see the shapes of his comrades ahead of him, or the glow of fires still burning in the town behind. The crossing itself was almost dreamlike in its quietness. The assault boats, the sappers' small craft, the rafts made from whatever materials could be gathered, they moved back and forth across the Rhine with a kind of steady rhythm, ferrying perhaps 30 men at a time across the dark water. The river, which had been their objective, had become their only hope of escape. Some men, watching the far bank grow closer, felt a strange mixture of relief and grief. Relief that they were getting out alive, grief that they were leaving the battle unfinished, leaving comrades behind who were too wounded to move. Not everyone made it. Some men, isolated in the perimeter's farthest reaches, never received the word to withdraw. Some were captured by advancing German troops who suddenly found themselves inside positions that should have been held. Some, in the chaos of the night and the darkness, simply became separated and were taken prisoner in the morning when the true scope of what had happened became apparent. The perimeter was not evacuated cleanly. It was more a dissolving, a gradual thinning, until German soldiers, pressing forward, realized that the British were gone. The Waffen-SS divisions, aware by dawn that the evacuation had occurred, made no particular effort to pursue across the river. They had accomplished their mission. The Arnhem pocket was cleared. The British airborne had been defeated in detail, pushed out of their objectives, forced to withdraw, in what could only be counted as a German victory. The cost had been severe. Officers and men of the 9th and 10th divisions had paid in blood and exhaustion for every day of the fighting, but the objective had been achieved. By the time the light came fully, approximately 2,000 men had made it across the Rhine. Many more, unable to reach the evacuation points, had surrendered to the advancing Germans or remained hidden in the rubble, hoping to escape capture in the coming hours. The bridge at Arnhem, which had been held for so long by John Frost and his men, was now firmly in German hands. The corridor that was supposed to lead deep into the Reich lay closed, at least for now. Those soldiers who reached the southern bank found themselves among other British units, moving into defences that Texet Corps had established. Some of them wept, though whether from exhaustion or sorrow, or the simple release of tension that comes when one stops being shot at, no one quite knew. They were alive. The operation had failed, and the war, which so many had hoped might end by Christmas, would continue for many more long months ahead. The Rhine flowed on beneath the September sky, indifferent to the small tragedies of men that played out along its banks. When the last British soldiers crossed the Rhine in darkness on that September night, slipping away in assault boats while German flares lit the water above them, something had shifted irrevocably in the balance of those two Waffen-SS divisions. The 9th Hohenstaufen and the 10th Frundsberg had achieved what their commanders might have called a tactical victory. They had held the ground, contained the airborne forces, prevented the breakout northward that Montgomery had envisioned, and yet in holding that ground they had been hollowed out. The cost of Arnhem, though perhaps less catastrophic than what the Allies had suffered, had etched itself into their depleted strength in ways that would echo through the winter months ahead. The 9th SS Hohenstaufen, that division which had scrambled so frantically in those early September days to assemble its scattered battle groups and rush toward the sound of falling parachutes, had suffered somewhere in the region of 400 to 500 casualties during the entire Arnhem operation, killed, wounded, and missing combined. It sounds almost modest when set against the thousands lost by the 1st British Airborne, yet for a division already worn thin by Normandy, already patched together with replacements who barely knew one another, it represented a significant hemorrhage of combat strength. More troubling still was the loss of specific expertise of veteran non-commissioned officers and junior leaders whose absence would be felt in every action undertaken in the months that followed. Tank crews were shortened. Platoons operated with fewer than their authorized strength. The institutional knowledge of how to conduct rapid concentration and mobile defense, lessons written in the blood of earlier campaigns, had to be transmitted to younger soldiers, many of whom would themselves not survive the winter. The 10th Frundsberg Division, meanwhile, had thrown itself into the battle around Nijmegen with particular ferocity, blocking the narrow corridor and contesting every bridge crossing. For their exertion, they too had paid. Their losses clustered around similar figures, hundreds rather than thousands, but hundreds nonetheless extracted from a force that possessed no reserve of surplus manpower. What made their losses perhaps more consequential was the nature of their dispersal afterward. The Frundsberg, having fought with particular distinction in the southern sector around Nijmegen, found itself designated for service in entirely different theatres as the autumn deepened. There would be no quiet refit for them, no chance to absorb replacements in the rear areas and rebuild cohesion. Instead, elements of the division began a long journey toward the Ardennes, toward the Eifel Plateau, toward the gathering of forces for what the German High Command was already contemplating as a desperate winter offensive. It is difficult to imagine a division less prepared for such an undertaking, yet the logic of Germany's strategic predicament admitted no alternative. Both divisions were withdrawn from the direct vicinity of Arnhem in the weeks following the evacuation, pulled back to areas where they might attempt to recover something of their former organizational strength. The 9th Hohenstaufen remained in the general area of the lower Rhine, occupying defensive positions that would, in theory, allow them to receive replacements and new equipment. The reality was more austere. German industry, under increasingly intensive Allied bombing pressure, was struggling to produce sufficient tanks, artillery pieces, and ammunition. The divisions could expect replacements, yes, but not the kind that would truly restore them. Young soldiers arrived, many of them drafted from rear area units or from the Wehrmacht proper, rather than the SS volunteers who had formed the original cadres. These newcomers were often competent, sometimes brave, but they lacked the cohesion and the hard-trained expertise of the men they replaced. Mechanically, both divisions were running on fumes by October 1944. Fuel remained desperately scarce. The loss of France meant that German armour was now consuming greater quantities of fuel simply to remain operational in a contracted tactical space. Tank engines that had been carefully husbanded during the Normandy campaign were now being run harder and more frequently. Maintenance became increasingly difficult as supply lines lengthened and disruption became the constant state of logistics. It is a peculiar irony of military history that the side possessing superior defensive terrain, the Germans now holding fortified positions along the Maas and Rhine rivers, often suffers greater material deprivation than the attacking force, which at least possesses the relative mobility and supply abundance of an advancing army. The 9th and 10th divisions found themselves in precisely this position, stationary, watching the enemy across the water or across the bridgeheads, and gradually running out of resources to respond effectively if and when that enemy moved again. By November 1944, both divisions had been significantly reduced in operational status. The 9th Hohenstaufen, under the command of Oberführer Wilhelm Bittrich, a highly capable SS officer who had navigated the complexities of SS service with remarkable political survival instinct, was nominally reorganized into something more resembling a grenadier division than a full-strength panzer formation. The implication was clear: there would be no armoured counterattacks, no lightning mobile operations. Instead, the 9th would hold defensive ground, and it would do so with infantry tactics, supported by whatever armour remained operational. This was a bitter transformation for a unit that had prided itself on aggressive mobility and mechanized warfare doctrine. Yet such transformations were becoming commonplace across the German order of battle as 1944 ebbed toward 1945. The 10th Frundsberg, under the command of Brigadeführer Heinz Harmel, was likewise in the process of severe organizational disruption when it received its orders to move toward the Ardennes. Harmel, like Bittrich, was a figure of considerable personal authority within the SS officer corps, a man who had proven his combat leadership across multiple campaigns and who maintained a degree of independence from the ideological apparatus that animated the SS at higher levels. It is worth noting that these commanding officers, Bittrich, Harmel, and others of their generation within the Waffen-SS, occupied an unusual and often contradictory position. They were committed to the German war effort in ways that transcended mere professional soldiering, yet they were also acutely aware of the deteriorating military situation and the vast gap between strategic fantasy and tactical reality. Whether this awareness transformed into any meaningful act of resistance or merely into a kind of professional fatalism remains a subject of historical speculation and considerable debate. What is certain is that both divisions, depleted and reorganized though they were, began a long decline toward insignificance as the winter of 1944 approached. They were no longer the formations that had earned their reputations in Normandy, or even in those frantic September days of 1944. They had become fragments, pieced together from salvage and reinforcement, expected to perform duties that their current strength could scarcely support. The prospect before them was the grinding defensive warfare of the Mars line, the bitter cold of the Rhineland winter, and the slow attrition of forces unable to be meaningfully replaced or reinforced. And then, for the 10th Frundsberg particularly, there came the extraordinary summons to participate in one final desperate gamble, the Ardennes offensive of December 1944, an operation for which they were profoundly unprepared and which would ultimately prove catastrophic, not merely for these divisions, but for the entire German war effort. Both formations would see the war's end, though in forms barely recognizable from their former glory. Survivors would be scattered across multiple theaters as Germany's military collapse accelerated through early 1945. Some would die in the collapse of the Third Reich, others would survive into captivity, into prisoner of war camps, into the long process of denazification and historical reckoning that followed the war's end. The grand historical moment that had seemed so vivid in September 1944, the massing of SS Panzer divisions near a great Dutch river, the sudden appearance of enemy paratroopers falling from the sky, the desperate improvisation of command and response, all of it now belonged to the past. What remained was merely the slow unwinding, the drawing down of forces, the recognition, however unspoken, that the war's trajectory could not be reversed by any effort these divisions might muster. In the quiet of the lower Rhine positions during the November rains, the men of the 9th Hohenstaufen and the 10th Frundsberg settled into something that resembled, perhaps, the beginning of resignation. In the years that followed, the fields around Arnhem and Oosterbeek returned slowly to the rhythms they had known before the parachutes came falling from the sky. The farmers replanted their orchards. The church bells that had fallen silent during those 9 days of September began to ring again on Sundays, their voices carrying across the same green countryside where so much had ended in ash and sorrow. And across the landscape, cemeteries grew, not all at once, but through the patient work of remembrance, as communities gathered to mark the places where young men, many of them barely more than boys, had come to rest in soil that was not their own. If you were to walk those grounds today, moving slowly between the rows of white stones, you might find yourself wondering about the particular ache that comes from reading the same names twice, once on the markers themselves, and again in the books kept in the visitors' centres, the registry of the fallen, that stands as a kind of secondary memory, a testament that these men were known, that their names were spoken, that they mattered. The British cemeteries tend toward a certain quiet formality, with their precise rows and their grass cut to a measured green. The German burial grounds scattered throughout the region carry a different weight, a different quality of silence. Sometimes there are more than 100 men beneath a single modest stone. The Waffen-SS 9th Panzer Division Hohenstaufen never truly recovered from Arnhem. The division that emerged from those 9 days was hollow in ways that machines and replacements could not easily fill. In the winter months that followed, it would be thrown into the Ardennes offensive, that desperate, freezing gamble that Hitler called Operation Barbarossa, the winter counterattack that would mark the beginning of the end for the Third Reich. By then, the men who had fought in the streets of Arnhem were already scattered or gone, and those who remained carried within them something that cannot be named in historical records, but might be felt in the quiet of their own thoughts, if any of them lived long enough to have such thoughts again. The 10th SS Panzer Division Frundsberg II faded into the shadow history of those final months. Divisions do not survive the collapse of empires unchanged. They are absorbed, renamed, merged with others, in desperate attempts to maintain the fiction of strength. By the spring of 1945, there was little left to distinguish either unit, except the weight of what they had done and the price they had paid for it. It is worth pausing here to consider a peculiar truth about human memory and the way we have come to regard these events. The men who died at Arnhem, both the British airborne soldiers and the German defenders, have long since passed from the world. The youngest of them would now be well over 100 years old. Most died decades ago, and yet the bridge still stands, the Rhine still flows. The September light still falls across Oosterbeek in the same slanting way it did in 1944, and the quality of that light, that particular golden-grey wash of early autumn afternoon, is precisely the same, indifferent to history, indifferent to the names of the dead. There is something about cemeteries that speaks to this indifference with unusual clarity, not cruelty necessarily, but a kind of cosmic neutrality. The grass grows over the stones, the rain falls, the seasons turn, 100 years pass as they passed before, and will pass again after. The names themselves, Volkmann, Richardson, Schulze, Mackenzie, begin to lose their connection to the men who bore them. They become simply inscriptions, sound without substance, letters on stone that fewer and fewer people will bend down to read. And yet there is also in cemeteries a persistence of care, a human refusal to let indifference win completely. Someone has mowed this grass, someone has swept these stones, someone has brought flowers, though perhaps not in September, when the weather turns unpredictable and the living have their own harvests to gather. The Dutch people who live near these cemeteries, who walk past them on their way to work or to church, have made a kind of unspoken compact with the dead buried there. They have said, in effect, "You will not be forgotten." Not perfectly, perhaps, not with the accuracy of history books, but you will be remembered as places remember, as soil remembers, as the patient work of tending remembers. If you consider what historians have found in their careful study of those 9 days, you come to understand that Arnhem was never quite what anyone intended it to be. The British airborne soldiers expected to hold the bridge for a few hours before armour arrived from the south. The Germans never expected to face an airborne invasion at all, let alone one of that scale. The Dutch people living in the towns caught in the middle were expecting nothing in particular except to survive, as people in occupied lands always survive, through a kind of deliberate narrowing of the present moment to what can be managed today, this hour, this very minute. None of them got what they expected. Very few events in history do, and in that failure of expectation, in that collision between what was planned and what actually occurred, lies something that seems worth meditating upon as the mind begins to let go of wakefulness, as the day loosens its grip on consciousness. We make our plans. We gather our forces, we believe ourselves capable of controlling outcomes, and then the world unfolds according to a logic that we can only understand after the fact, if we understand it at all. The 2 SS Panzer Divisions came to Arnhem thinking one thing and discovered themselves caught in another thing entirely. The British paratroopers came thinking they would hold a bridge and found instead that they were fighting a war within a war, a smaller, more intimate conflict compressed into 9 days and a few square miles of Dutch earth. The Rhine continues to flow past all of this. It flows in a manner almost completely unchanged from how it flowed in September 1944, carrying the same burden of water toward the sea, indifferent to the names written in its banks' stone and soil. The river has no memory, except the memory inherent in water's endless motion, its endless return to the sea, and rise again in clouds, and descent again as rain. In a sense, the river's memory is the only perfect one, complete, without judgment, without the human tendency to reshape events according to what we wish had happened, or what we believe should have happened. Yet there is something in the quality of light and water and stone at Arnhem even now, something in the way the Dutch autumn feels, that seems to hold within it the residue of those 9 days. Not as trauma, perhaps, but as a kind of tender awareness. The people who live there are the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of people who lived through it. They carry it not in their memories, they do not remember it themselves, but in the stories they were told, in the stories their grandparents told, stories that have by now been worn smooth with repetition and time, stories that have perhaps lost some accuracy in the process of being passed from one generation to the next, but which have gained in their place a different kind of truth, the truth that comes from being integrated into a community's sense of itself. In the gathering dusk, as the sun settles beyond the western edge of the landscape, and the countryside begins its slow descent into evening and then into night, it is perhaps worth considering that all events eventually become like this. They become stories. They become names on stones. They become the particular quality of light on water, the feeling that something once happened here, though the specific details grow hazier with each passing year. This is not a small thing. This is how human meaning persists. Not through perfect historical accuracy, though that matters too, but through the slow work of remembrance, through the gathering and retelling of stories, through the simple act of walking through a cemetery and allowing oneself to feel the weight of all those names, all those men, all that intention and effort and courage and fear, compressed into 9 days and now resting beneath the September grass. The cemeteries around Arnhem grow quieter with each passing year, not because they are forgotten, but because fewer and fewer people remember them through direct connection. The elderly Dutch who sheltered paratroopers, who hid wounded men in their cellars, who offered what small mercy they could in the midst of urban warfare, most of them are now gone. The German veterans are gone. The British survivors are nearly all gone. And so the memory passes into the hands of historians, into the preservation of documents and photographs and recordings and books like this one, into the slow accumulation of stories that becomes, eventually, the only form in which these events can continue to exist in human consciousness. It is a peaceful thought, in its way. Not the events themselves. Nothing about 9 days of fighting can be peaceful, but the thought of how they are remembered, how they persist, how they have been transformed from the immediate terror and confusion and vivid pain of those hours into something more distant and abstract, and yet somehow more permanent. The men are gone. The guns are silent. The bridges stand empty of all but traffic, but the idea of Arnhem